What if I told you that beneath the vast Pacific Ocean lies the remains of an entire civilization that once rivaled Atlantis itself? Tonight, we're diving deep into the complete history of Mu, the legendary lost continent that supposedly stretched across millions of square miles of what is now open ocean. From ancient tablets discovered in remote temples to controversial archaeological evidence that mainstream science refuses to acknowledge, you're about to discover why some researchers believe Mu was humanity's forgotten motherland that vanished beneath the waves over 12,000 years ago. But before we dive in, if you're new to this channel, consider hitting that like and subscribe button if you haven't already. Your support means we can continue producing these highly researched videos to help you learn something new or pass the time. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. So without further ado, let's begin, shall we? The birth of a legend, Augustus Le Plongeon's lost world. The jungles of Yucatan in the 1870s held secrets that most scholars could only dream of reaching. Stone temples rose from the forest floor, carved glyphs covered ancient walls, and one man believed he alone could read their true message. Augustus Le Plongeon arrived in the Maya lands with credentials that seemed impressive. He'd studied in France, he'd practiced as a photographer in Peru and California. He spoke multiple languages and carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed he understood the ancient world better than anyone else. His wife, Alice Dixon Le Plongeon, accompanied him on expeditions that would last years. Together, they would document ruins, they would photograph sculptures, and Augustus would make claims that would echo through the next century. Le Plongeon became obsessed with a particular idea. He believed that the Maya were not simply one ancient culture among many. They were the source, the origin point, the mother of all civilization. Every achievement in Egypt, in Asia, in Europe, all of it flowed from this single wellspring in Central America. The evidence, he claimed, lay in the glyphs themselves. Le Plongeon developed his own system for reading Maya writing. He ignored the work of other scholars. He dismissed any interpretation that contradicted his vision. When he looked at the carved stones of Chichen Itza and Uxmal, he saw not the history of the Maya people, but the story of a vanished continent. He called it Mu. According to Le Plongeon's translations, the ancient Maya texts spoke of a vast landmass that had once existed. This continent, which he named Mu, had been home to an advanced society. Its people possessed wisdom that surpassed anything the modern world had achieved. They built great cities, they mastered arts and sciences. They sent colonists across the oceans to spread their knowledge. Then came disaster. Le Plongeon claimed the Maya records described a cataclysm of unimaginable scale. The earth shook, the seas rose. In a single night, or perhaps over a series of catastrophic events, Mu sank beneath the waves. Only a few survivors escaped to tell the tale. These refugees, Le Plongeon insisted, became the ancestors of the Maya, the Egyptians, and other ancient peoples. His specific claims grew more elaborate with time. He identified characters in Maya art as Queen Mu and Prince Ko. He wove elaborate narratives about their lives, their loves, their political intrigues. He connected Maya symbols to Egyptian hieroglyphs through superficial visual similarities. A bird here matched a bird there. A spiral design proved a shared origin. The fact that these symbols appeared in cultures separated by thousands of miles of ocean seemed to Le Plongeon to confirm rather than challenge his theory. The academic establishment did not embrace his work. Other Maya scholars found his translations incomprehensible. His linguistic methods had no basis in the actual structure of Maya language. When experts examined the same texts, they found no mention of sunken continents or catastrophic floods. They found royal genealogies. They found records of warfare and ritual. They found the everyday concerns of Maya city-states locked in competition with one another. Le Plongeon responded to criticism with anger and accusations. He claimed his peers were jealous. He insisted they lacked his insight. He continued to publish books and give lectures, presenting his theories to audiences who found them thrilling. The idea of a lost mother civilization captured imaginations in a way that careful archaeological work could not. His work appeared during a particular moment in Western thought. The late 19th century was obsessed with origins. Darwin's theories had raised questions about human development. Archaeologists were uncovering ancient cities in Mesopotamia and the Nile Valley. The public wanted answers about where civilization began. They wanted to know if there might be even older, greater societies waiting to be discovered. Le Plongeon offered a seductive answer. Civilization didn't develop slowly through the hard work of countless generations. It sprang forth fully formed from a single source, and that source wasn't in the Near East, where biblical tradition suggested. It was in the Americas, in the ruins he himself had explored. The photographs Le Plongeon and his wife took have lasting value. Their documentation of Maya sites captured details that would later be damaged or destroyed. Modern archaeologists still reference their images, but his interpretations, his translations, his entire theoretical framework, none of it has stood the test of time. Real Maya writing tells a different story. The glyphs record the names of actual rulers. They document alliances and conflicts between cities like Tikal, Copan, and Palenque. They track astronomical observations made with remarkable precision. They reveal a complex, sophisticated society that developed its own traditions over thousands of years. There is no mention of Mu, no record of a sunken continent, no evidence that the Maya considered themselves refugees from a lost homeland. Yet Le Plongeon had planted a seed. The word Mu now existed in the popular consciousness. It represented something people wanted to believe in, a golden age, a time of unity and wisdom, destroyed by forces beyond human control. Others would pick up where Le Plongeon left off. They would expand on his ideas. They would give Mu a geography, a history, and a mythology far more detailed than anything the photographer from Yucatan had imagined. The legend had been born. It would take on a life of its own. The Apostle of Mu, James Churchward's best-selling revelation. 20 years after Le Plongeon's death, another man would claim to possess the true history of Mu. But James Churchward would succeed where Le Plongeon had failed. He would make Mu a household name. His books would sell hundreds of thousands of copies, and he would move the lost continent from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. Churchward's background was as mysterious as the civilization he would spend his life promoting. Born in England in the 1850s, he claimed to have served in the British Army in India as a young man. He said he'd worked as a tea planter. He spoke of adventures in Asia, Australia, and the Pacific Islands. Much of his early biography remains difficult to verify. What is certain is that by the 1920s, living in New York, he had become obsessed with ancient mysteries. His origin story for the Mu theory had all the elements of a thrilling adventure tale. According to Churchward, while stationed in India decades earlier, he had befriended an elderly Hindu priest. This priest, over months of careful instruction, taught him to read an ancient script that predated all known writing systems. Together, they studied a collection of clay tablets hidden in the temple's secret archives. These tablets, the priest explained, were copies of even older records. They had been created by the Nakhals, a priestly brotherhood from the motherland. The Nakhals had escaped when their homeland sank and had preserved the true history of humanity. The tablets they left behind told of a vast continent that once dominated the Pacific Ocean. Churchward called it the motherland. He called it the Empire of the Sun. But most often he used the name Le Plongeon had coined, Mu. The civilization Churchward described was nothing short of paradise. Mu stretched across the Pacific, a continent larger than South America. It had 10 tribes, each with its own territory, but all united under a single government. The capital city gleamed with golden temples. 7 great cities housed a population of 64 million souls. They grew food in abundance. They had no wars. They lived in harmony with their environment. The people of Mu had, according to Churchward, achieved technological wonders. They built vast stone structures. They created a system of canals and raised roads. They developed a form of writing that would later influence cultures around the globe. They understood principles of engineering that wouldn't be rediscovered until modern times. More importantly, they possessed spiritual wisdom. The inhabitants of Mu worshipped a single creator God. They understood the fundamental unity of all religions. Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, and every other faith were merely corrupted versions of the original Mu teachings. The symbols used in these religions, the cross, the lotus, the sacred tree, all originated in the motherland. Then, around 12,000 years ago, disaster struck. Churchward described a catastrophe that unfolded over several days. First came earthquakes, then volcanic eruptions. The ground itself began to sink. Gas-filled caverns beneath the continent collapsed, pulling the land down into the abyss. Tidal waves swept across what remained. Fire rained from the sky. In a final paroxysm, Mu disappeared beneath the Pacific, taking 64 million people to their graves. Only a few survived. Some had already established colonies on distant shores. Others escaped in boats, fleeing the destruction. These refugees scattered across the world. They settled in Asia, becoming the ancestors of the Chinese and Indians. They reached the Americas, where they built the civilizations later encountered by Spanish conquistadors. They even made it to the Mediterranean, influencing the development of Egyptian and Mesopotamian cultures. Churchward presented his case in The Lost Continent of Mu, published in 1926. The book became an immediate sensation. He followed it with additional volumes, The Children of Mu in 1931, The Sacred Symbols of Mu in 1933, and The Cosmic Forces of Mu in 1934. Each book elaborated on his theory. Each claimed to present more evidence from ancient sources. His evidence was eclectic, to say the least. He pointed to similarities in pyramid construction across different continents. He cited myths of floods and fallen lands from cultures around the Pacific. He reproduced symbols from temples in Southeast Asia, claiming they were Mu writing. He drew connections between place names in Polynesia and his imagined motherland. He even cited geological findings about the Pacific seafloor, interpreting them in ways that scientists themselves never intended. The public loved it. In the 1920s and 1930s, people were hungry for grand narratives. The First World War had shattered old certainties. New discoveries in archaeology kept making headlines. The idea of a lost super-civilization spoke to something deep in the cultural moment. Churchward gave lectures, he appeared in newspapers, his books were translated into multiple languages. Critics, however, found his work deeply flawed. Actual scholars of ancient India pointed out that no such tablets had ever been found. The script Churchward claimed to have learned didn't correspond to any known writing system. His reproductions of supposedly ancient texts looked suspiciously like his own inventions. When he cited archaeological sites, he often misrepresented what had actually been found there. His linguistic theories were perhaps the most problematic. Churchward claimed that similar-sounding words in different languages proved a common Mu origin. The Polynesian word moana meant ocean. The English word moon sounded similar. Therefore, both came from Mu. This type of reasoning ignored everything linguists knew about how languages actually develop and change over time. Geologists were equally unimpressed. By the 1930s, evidence for continental drift was mounting. Scientists understood that continents moved slowly over millions of years. They didn't appear and disappear in catastrophic events. The Pacific floor was fundamentally different from continental crust. A landmass the size Churchward described couldn't simply sink without leaving obvious traces. But Churchward was not writing for geologists or linguists. He was writing for ordinary readers who wanted to believe in something larger than themselves. He was writing for people who found modern life alienating and longed for a simpler, more spiritual past. He was writing for those who saw patterns in the ruins of ancient civilizations and wanted those patterns to mean something profound. In this, he succeeded spectacularly. Churchward's Mu became the standard version of the myth. When people spoke of the lost Pacific continent, they meant his Mu, not Le Plongeon's. His books remained in print for decades. They influenced countless other writers. They shaped how popular culture imagined ancient mysteries. James Churchward passed in 1936, still convinced that he had revealed humanity's true origins. His legacy was a compelling story, told with confidence and illustrated with enticing images. Whether that story had any basis in reality was a question for another generation to answer. The geological impossibility, continental drift, and the Pacific Basin. The earth beneath our feet is not as solid as it seems. Continents move. Oceans open and close. Mountains rise and erode away. The planet's surface is in constant, slow motion. Understanding these processes is essential to evaluating claims about lost continents. The theory that would revolutionize our understanding of Earth took decades to gain acceptance. In 1912, a German scientist named Alfred Wegener proposed that continents had once been joined in a single massive landmass. He called it Pangaea. Over hundreds of millions of years, this supercontinent broke apart. The pieces drifted to their current positions. South America fit against Africa like puzzle pieces. Similar fossils appeared on continents now separated by vast oceans. The evidence seemed compelling. Most geologists initially rejected Wegener's ideas. They couldn't imagine a mechanism that could move entire continents. The Earth's crust seemed too rigid. The forces required seemed impossible. Wegener faced ridicule at scientific conferences. His theory languished for decades, supported by mounting evidence, but lacking an explanation for how the movement actually occurred. The answer came from studying the ocean floors. In the 1950s and 1960s, new technology allowed scientists to map the seafloor in detail. What they found transformed geology. Mid-ocean ridges ran down the centers of the Atlantic and other oceans like the seams on a baseball. Volcanic activity created new crust along these ridges. The seafloor spread outward from the ridges, pushing continents apart. At the edges of continents, old oceanic crust descended back into the Earth's mantle in deep trenches. This was plate tectonics. The Earth's outer shell consisted of several large plates and numerous smaller ones. These plates moved at rates of a few centimeters per year, about as fast as fingernails grow. Where plates collided, mountains formed, or one plate descended beneath another. Where they pulled apart, new ocean floor emerged. Where they slid past each other, earthquakes shook the ground. The Pacific Ocean told a particularly clear story. Unlike the Atlantic, which opened as South America pulled away from Africa, the Pacific was shrinking. The Pacific Plate was the largest of all tectonic plates, but it was being consumed at its edges, sliding beneath the continents that surrounded it. The Ring of Fire, a zone of intense volcanic and seismic activity, marked where the Pacific Plate met other plates. Most importantly for our story, the Pacific floor was fundamentally different from continents. Continental crust is thick and light, composed primarily of granite and related rocks. It's buoyant, like a raft floating on the denser material below. Oceanic crust is thin and heavy, made mostly of basalt. It forms at mid-ocean ridges and eventually sinks back into the mantle at subduction zones. This difference is crucial. Continents don't sink because they can't. They're too light. They float on the mantle beneath them. Even if some catastrophic event shattered a continent into pieces, those pieces would still float. They might drift apart, but they wouldn't plunge into the depths. The Pacific Plate has existed in various forms for hundreds of millions of years, but the current Pacific floor is relatively young in geological terms. Most of it formed within the last 200 million years. As old oceanic crust descended at subduction zones, new crust continuously formed at spreading ridges. This process left clear evidence in the magnetic properties of seafloor rocks. Scientists could read the Pacific's history like rings in a tree. That history contained no trace of a sunken continent. The seafloor showed the expected pattern of spreading and subduction. Seamounts, underwater mountains, appeared where volcanic hotspots had punched through the moving plate. Island chains formed as the plate carried volcanoes away from their source, like a conveyor belt. But nowhere was there evidence of continental granite beneath the waves. If Churchward's Mew had existed and sank 12,000 years ago, it would still be there. Continental material doesn't dissolve. It doesn't mysteriously vanish. The Pacific floor would show massive blocks of granite. Sediment layers would record the catastrophic sinking. The weight of all that material would have left marks on the surrounding seafloor. None of this evidence exists. Some proponents of lost continents argued that Mew's remains lay at great depth, perhaps in trenches where they'd been pulled down by subduction. But subduction operates on timescales of millions of years, not thousands. And even then, only oceanic crust gets subducted. Continental material is too light. When continents collide with subduction zones, they crumple and fold. They create mountain ranges like the Himalayas. They don't sink. Others suggested that Mew consisted of a different type of land, perhaps a large plateau that somehow collapsed. But the Pacific seafloor mapping showed no evidence of such a feature. The major plateaus in the Pacific, like the Ontong Java Plateau, were submarine volcanic formations that never rose above sea level. They formed from massive outpourings of lava, not from any continent-building process. The depth of the Pacific also posed problems. Much of the ocean floor lies more than 4,000 meters below the surface. If Mu had existed at sea level 12,000 years ago, it would have had to sink that entire distance. The energy required for such an event would have been catastrophic beyond imagination. The displacement of water would have created tsunamis that would have scoured every coastline on the planet. The geological record shows no evidence of such a global catastrophe at that time. Sea levels did change at the end of the last ice age around 12,000 years ago. When massive ice sheets melted, oceans rose by about 120 meters. This flooding submerged coastal areas and continental shelves, but it happened gradually over thousands of years, and it affected coastlines, not entire continents. The land didn't sink, the water rose. Modern geological mapping of the Pacific is extraordinarily detailed. Satellites measure subtle variations in the ocean surface that reveal the topography of the seafloor below. Ships with sonar systems have crisscrossed the ocean countless times. Submersibles have descended to the deepest trenches. All of this data creates a picture of the Pacific Basin that leaves no room for a missing continent. The Earth's crust keeps records of its own history. Rock types tell us where they formed. Magnetic patterns reveal ancient positions. Fossil distributions show where land connections once existed. Every piece of evidence, properly understood, confirms the plate tectonic model, and that model leaves no possibility for Churchward's Mu or any similar Pacific continent. This doesn't mean the Pacific lacks mysteries. Ancient shorelines now underwater, volcanic islands that rose and eroded away, these features exist and deserve study, but they're not remnants of a sunken civilization. They're the natural products of geological processes we now understand quite well. The science is clear. The geological evidence is overwhelming. A continent-sized landmass could not have existed in the Pacific Ocean 12,000 years ago or at any recent point in Earth's history. Mu, as described by Churchward, is geologically impossible. Real-world cataclysms, the volcanic and tectonic forces of the Pacific Rim. The Pacific Ocean is not a place of geological calm. The same forces that make a lost continent impossible also create real disasters of stunning scale. Understanding these actual events helps explain why myths of vanished lands arose in the first place. The Ring of Fire encircles the Pacific like a necklace of destruction. This zone, roughly following the ocean's rim, hosts about 75% of the world's active volcanoes. It's where most of the planet's largest earthquakes occur. The reason is plate tectonics. The Pacific Plate and several smaller plates dive beneath the surrounding continents, generating intense geological activity. Volcanic eruptions in this region can be catastrophic. When Mount Tambora in Indonesia erupted in 1815, it ejected so much material that global temperatures dropped. The following year became known as the year without summer. Crops failed across the northern hemisphere. The eruption itself was heard hundreds of miles away. Tsunamis struck nearby coasts. An estimated 71,000 people perished from the direct effects and subsequent famine. Even larger eruptions have occurred in the deeper past. The Toba supereruption about 74,000 years ago released energy equivalent to thousands of nuclear weapons. Ash fell across South and Southeast Asia. The volcanic winter that followed lasted for years. Some scientists theorize this event may have pushed human populations to the brink of extinction, though this remains a subject of debate among researchers. Genetic studies show our species went through a severe bottleneck around this time, but whether Toba caused it is still uncertain. The world's climate shifted for years. Indonesia alone has witnessed multiple civilization-altering eruptions. Krakatoa's 1883 explosion destroyed two-thirds of the island. The sound was the loudest in recorded history. People heard it nearly 3,000 miles away. The resulting tsunamis drowned entire coastal towns. Ash in the atmosphere created spectacular sunsets worldwide for months. More than 36,000 people lost their lives. Earthquakes along the Ring of Fire reshaped coastlines in moments. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake off Japan measured magnitude 9.1. It shifted the main island of Honshu 8 feet eastward. The seafloor off the coast rose several meters. The tsunami that followed reached heights of over 40 meters in some locations. It traveled across the entire Pacific, causing damage as far as California and Chile. Similar events punctuate the region's history. The 1960 Chilean earthquake, magnitude 9.5, remains the most powerful ever recorded. It triggered tsunamis that reached Hawaii, Japan, and the Philippines. The 1964 Alaska earthquake, magnitude 9.2, altered the coastline dramatically. Some areas rose 38 feet, others dropped 8 feet. The tsunami destroyed villages and killed over 100 people. Subduction zones, where oceanic plates descend beneath continents, create conditions for these megaquakes. Pressure builds for decades or centuries. Then the plates suddenly slip, releasing energy in seconds. The Cascadia subduction zone off the Pacific Northwest coast of North America has the potential for similar events. Geological evidence shows it has produced massive earthquakes roughly every 500 years. Island volcanoes can disappear entirely. Krakatoa's 1883 eruption obliterated most of the island. What remained was a submerged caldera. Anak Krakatoa, child of Krakatoa, later grew from the ruins. In 2018, it partially collapsed into the sea, creating another deadly tsunami. Islands can form and vanish within human lifetimes. The Pacific seafloor itself shows evidence of massive events. Underwater landslides have sent cubic kilometers of material cascading down slopes. These events, though rare, can displace enough water to create tsunamis without any earthquake. The Hawaiian Islands have ancient debris fields extending hundreds of miles from sudden collapses of volcanic slopes. Volcanic islands in the Pacific follow a pattern. They form over hotspots, stationary sources of magma that punch through the moving Pacific plate. The island grows while positioned above the hotspot. Then the plate carries it away. Cut off from its source, the volcano becomes dormant. Erosion wears it down. Eventually, the island sinks beneath the waves as the cooling oceanic crust subsides under its weight. The Hawaiian island chain demonstrates this process clearly. The Big Island sits over the hotspot and remains volcanically active. Islands to the northwest are progressively older and more eroded. Beyond the main islands, underwater seamounts mark where ancient islands once stood. The Emperor Seamount chain extends thousands of miles to the northwest, showing where Hawaii's hotspot created islands millions of years ago. These natural processes, eruptions, earthquakes, tsunamis, and sinking islands, certainly traumatized human populations. Coastal communities witnessed islands vanish. They felt the earth shake. They fled advancing walls of water. Oral traditions preserved memories of these disasters. Stories passed down through generations spoke of lands swallowed by the sea and fires from below. The Pacific peoples had good reason to fear volcanic activity. The islands of the Pacific formed from volcanoes. Many remained active. People settled on these islands knowing the ground could shake or erupt. They built societies aware that disaster might strike. Their myths and legends reflected this reality. Consider Santorini in the Aegean Sea, which shares similar geology. The Minoan eruption around 1600 BCE devastated the ancient Thera settlement. It may have inspired Greek legends of Atlantis. The explosion was smaller than Toba, but occurred in a populated region. Tsunamis struck nearby Crete. Ash blanketed the eastern Mediterranean. The event entered cultural memory, transformed by time into tales of divine punishment and lost kingdoms. Similar processes likely influenced Pacific traditions. An eruption that destroyed a settlement could become, over centuries, a story of an entire land sinking. A tsunami that swept away coastal villages might transform into legends of angry gods flooding the world. Real disasters, experienced and remembered, provided the raw material for myths. The Pacific's geological violence also offered a veneer of plausibility to claims about Mu. When Churchward described volcanic cataclysms destroying his continent, he was describing processes that actually occurred in the Pacific. He simply misapplied them. Volcanoes do explode with civilization-ending force. Islands do sink. The seafloor does move and change. These facts made his fiction seem more believable. But there's a crucial difference between an island sinking and a continent vanishing, between a volcanic eruption devastating a region and gas chambers collapsing beneath an entire landmass, between real geological processes that operate over millions of years and imagined catastrophes that occur in days. The Pacific's true geological story is dramatic enough. It doesn't require embellishment. The Ring of Fire remains active. Volcanoes will erupt again. Earthquakes will strike, islands will rise and fall. These are not signs of lost continents or ancient curses. They're the natural consequences of a dynamic planet. They're proof that the Earth beneath us is alive, constantly reshaping itself through forces we're only beginning to fully understand. Understanding these real processes makes the myths less necessary. The Pacific's actual history is more wondrous than any fiction. The literary ancestors, from Atlantis to Theosophy. Every myth has a genealogy. Mu didn't spring from nowhere. It descended from older stories, adapted and transformed by each generation of storytellers. To understand Mu, we must trace its lineage back through the lost continents that came before. The oldest and most influential of these tales was Atlantis. Around 360 BCE, the Greek philosopher Plato wrote two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, that described a powerful island nation. According to Plato's account, Atlantis lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. It commanded a vast empire. Its capital featured concentric rings of water and land, with grand palaces and a magnificent temple. The Atlanteans were initially virtuous but grew corrupt and aggressive. The gods decided to punish them. In a single day and night, earthquakes and floods destroyed Atlantis. The island sank into the sea, leaving only dangerous shoals. Plato presented this as a true story passed down through Egyptian priests to the Athenian lawgiver Solon. Most scholars, ancient and modern, regard it as a moral allegory. Plato used Atlantis to illustrate points about ideal societies and their decline. But Plato's literary invention took on a life of its own. Later writers treated Atlantis as historical fact. Medieval and Renaissance authors speculated about its location. Was it in the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, somewhere else entirely? The story captured imaginations because it suggested that great civilizations could rise and fall, leaving barely a trace. The 19th century brought renewed interest in lost civilizations. Archaeology was revealing ancient cultures previously known only from myth and scripture. Troy, described by Homer, turned out to be real. So did Nineveh and Babylon. If these legendary cities existed, why not Atlantis? In 1882, an American writer named Ignatius Donnelly published Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. The book became an enormous bestseller. Donnelly argued that Atlantis was not only real, but was the source of all human civilization. Egypt, Mesoamerica, India all received their knowledge from Atlantean colonists. He pointed to similarities in myths, architecture, and customs across cultures. These similarities, he claimed, could only be explained by a common origin. Donnelly's methods resembled those Laplanjon and Churchward would later use. He cherry-picked data that supported his theory. He ignored contradictory evidence. He drew connections based on superficial resemblances. But his writing was compelling. He mixed genuine archaeological findings with wild speculation. Readers found his arguments persuasive, even if scholars did not. Around the same time, another influence emerged from a very different source. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky founded the Theosophical Society in 1875. Theosophy blended elements from Eastern religions, Western esoteric traditions, and Blavatsky's own elaborate mythology. She claimed to receive wisdom from advanced spiritual beings called the Mahatmas. Blavatsky's major work, The Secret Doctrine, published in 1888, presented a cosmic history of humanity. According to her system, humanity had evolved through several root races, each inhabiting different continents. The third root race, the Lemurians, lived on a continent in the Indian and Pacific Oceans. They were gigantic, egg-laying hermaphrodites who communicated through telepathy. They eventually developed physical bodies and sexual reproduction. The fourth root race, the Atlanteans, succeeded the Lemurians. They developed advanced technology but fell into corruption. Their civilization destroyed itself through misuse of power. The survivors scattered across the world. Present humanity, the fifth root race, descended from them. Blavatsky's Lemuria took its name from a scientific hypothesis. In the 19th century, naturalists noted that lemurs lived in Madagascar and India, but not in Africa or the Middle East. To explain this distribution, some proposed a former land bridge or continent connecting these regions. They called it Lemuria. When plate tectonics explained continental drift, the Lemuria hypothesis became unnecessary. But Blavatsky had already incorporated it into her cosmology. Theosophy influenced Western spiritualism profoundly. It offered ancient wisdom traditions. It promised secret knowledge. It appealed to those who found conventional religion unsatisfying, but wanted something more than pure materialism. Blavatsky's books sold widely. Her society established chapters around the world. These three streams, Plato's Atlantis, Donnelly's hyperdiffusionism, and Blavatsky's Lemuria, created the intellectual environment in which Mu emerged. Le drew from Plato and Donnelly. He placed his lost civilization in the Atlantic, like Atlantis, but claimed it was the Maya homeland. Churchward was almost certainly familiar with both Donnelly and Blavatsky. He moved his continent to the Pacific, closer to Blavatsky's Lemuria, but gave it a much more detailed history than she had. The relationship between Lemuria and Mu became confused in popular culture. Some writers used the names interchangeably. Others tried to distinguish them, sometimes placing them in different time periods or locations. Blavatsky's Lemuria was older and more spiritual. Churchward's Mu was more recent and more technological, but both served similar functions in their respective mythologies. These lost continents shared common features. They were advanced civilizations in a distant past. They possessed knowledge that later cultures forgot. They met catastrophic ends. They left scattered survivors who preserved fragments of their wisdom. These survivors explained similarities across different cultures. The myth suggested that human civilization peaked in the past rather than progressing steadily. This idea appealed to many people. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were periods of rapid change. Traditional societies faced disruption. Industrialization transformed daily life. Wars devastated Europe. In this context, stories of ancient golden ages offered comfort. They suggested that humanity had once been better, wiser, more peaceful. Perhaps that state could be recovered. The Lost Continent genre also reflected anxieties about empire and race. Both Donnelly and Churchward described their vanished civilizations as racially superior. They suggested that modern primitive peoples were degenerate descendants of nobler ancestors. This thinking aligned with the scientific racism prevalent at the time. It justified colonialism by portraying indigenous peoples as fallen remnants who needed guidance from more advanced races. Modern readers should recognize these ideas as deeply flawed and harmful. They were wrong then and remain wrong now. But understanding this context helps explain why lost continent theories gained traction. They served ideological purposes beyond simple historical curiosity. The literary tradition of lost continents continues to influence popular culture. Writers from H.P. Lovecraft to modern science fiction authors have drawn on these myths. They provide ready-made settings for adventure stories. They offer mysteries to solve. They tap into a longing for lost knowledge and vanished greatness. But the actual evidence for these continents has never materialized. No tablets describing Mu have been found in Indian temples. The Pacific seafloor shows no trace of sunken continents. The similarities between cultures that inspired these theories can be explained through human psychology, independent invention, or actual historical contact through trade and migration. The literary ancestors of Mu Atlantis, Donnelly's theories, and Blavatsky's Lemuria all share this characteristic. They were compelling stories. They served cultural and psychological needs, but they were not history. They were mythology, modern myths created for modern audiences, dressed in the language of archaeology and science. Voices from the Islands, Pacific Islander creation and origin myths. The Pacific Islands hold genuine treasures of oral tradition. For thousands of years, peoples across Oceania preserved their histories, genealogies, and sacred knowledge through carefully maintained oral accounts. These traditions tell their own stories of origins, migrations, and ancestral homelands. They deserve attention on their own terms, not as evidence for Western fantasies. The Kumalipo stands as one of the most remarkable creation chants ever preserved. This Hawaiian tradition traces the universe's origins through more than 2,000 lines of poetry. It begins with the birth of the cosmos in darkness. Simple life forms emerge first. Gradually, complexity increases. Plants appear, then fish, then birds, then land animals. Finally, humans enter the world. The chant doesn't describe creation from nothing. It presents birth and transformation. Each stage grows from what came before. The recitation creates a genealogy connecting humans to all of life, and all of life to the fundamental forces of the cosmos. Hawaiian chiefs memorized the Kumulipo to establish their sacred lineage. Queen Liliuokalani translated it into English in the 1890s while imprisoned after the overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom. The Kumulipo contains no mention of sunken continents. It doesn't describe refugees fleeing catastrophe. It presents a world emerging from darkness through natural processes, with humans as the most recent branch on a vast family tree that includes all living things. Other Pacific traditions speak of ancestral homelands, but these are not lost continents. The Polynesian concept of Hawaii appears in myths and chants across the region. Maori traditions in Aotearoa speak of Hawaii as the place from which their ancestors voyaged. Tahitian and Hawaiian traditions have similar concepts. The name varies slightly, Hawaii, Hawaii, but the concept remains consistent. Hawaii represents the ancestral homeland, the place of origin, but it's not a sunken continent. Most scholars understand Hawaii as a memory of actual places from which Polynesians migrated. It likely refers to various islands in central Polynesia, perhaps the Society Islands or other locations where Polynesian culture developed before spreading to more distant islands. Different island groups may remember different places as Hawaii, reflecting their specific migration routes. These origin traditions are migration narratives, not catastrophe myths. They describe deliberate voyages of discovery and settlement. Chants preserve the names of the canoes used. They list the navigators who led each journey. They record the provisions taken aboard. These are not tales of desperate refugees fleeing disaster. They're proud accounts of ancestors who mastered the ocean. The Samoan creation myth, passed down through generations, describes how the god Tagaloa created the islands. He sent a bird to fly over the endless ocean. Finding no land, he threw down stones to create islands. He created plants, then animals, then humans from worms that lived in rotting vines. This origin story emerges from the islands themselves. It doesn't claim connection to a foreign source. Tongan traditions speak of the divine ancestor Maui, who appears throughout Polynesian mythology. Maui fished up islands from the ocean floor. He slowed the sun's journey across the sky. He brought fire to humanity. These stories explain natural features and cultural practices. They establish the sacred nature of the land. They don't reference vanished empires. The traditions of Rapa Nui carry particular weight because writers often cited Easter Island as proof of Mu's existence. The island's isolation seemed to demand explanation. How did people reach such a remote place? Western observers assumed they must be remnants of a larger civilization. But Rapa Nui oral traditions tell a different story. They speak of Hotumatua, the paramount chief who led the first settlers to the island. The voyage was intentional, not accidental. Hotumatua's scouts had discovered the island previously. When conflict arose on their home island, possibly Mangariva or another in the Gambier group, Hotumatua led his people on a planned migration. The Rapa Nui built their own unique culture. The Moai statues represent their ancestors. The Rongorongo writing system, if it is indeed writing, developed on the island itself. The elaborate Birdman cult centered on competition and social organization specific to their island environment. None of this required a sunken continent to explain. Micronesian traditions offer equally rich material. The people of Pohnpei, home to the ruins of Nanmadol, maintain detailed oral histories about the site's construction. They attributed it to the Saudeleur dynasty, which ruled for perhaps 500 years. The stories describe how the rulers used magical powers to move the massive basalt stones. But they also preserve the names of rulers, the conflicts between districts, and the eventual overthrow of the Saudeleur by an outside conqueror named Geological. These traditions are sophisticated historical accounts. They contain legendary elements, certainly. Magic and divine intervention appear in the stories, but they also preserve genuine historical information. Archaeological work at Nanmadol confirms the basic timeline preserved in oral tradition. The site was built when the stories say it was built. The radiocarbon dates match the traditional chronology remarkably well. The Chamorro people of the Mariana Islands preserved traditions stretching back many generations. They spoke of ancestral spirits called Tau Taomana who inhabited the land. They maintained elaborate social hierarchies and stone architecture long before European contact. Their latte stones, massive pillars topped with hemispherical caps, appeared nowhere else in the Pacific. This was an indigenous development, not an import from a sunken continent. Throughout Oceania, creation myths and origin stories share certain themes: the ocean as source and sustainer, islands as gifts from the gods or as lands fished up from the depths, ancestors who voyaged from other lands, heroes who established order and culture. These patterns reflect the real experience of people living on islands in a vast ocean. But Churchward and others fundamentally misunderstood these traditions. When Pacific Islanders spoke of lands to the west or remembered ancestral homelands, Western writers assumed they meant lost continents. When islanders described their ancestors as powerful navigators, outsiders concluded they must have inherited knowledge from a superior civilization. When creation myths mentioned islands rising from the sea, theorists claimed these were memories of Mu's sinking. This misinterpretation did real harm. It denied Pacific peoples their own history. It suggested their achievements required external explanation. It transformed their carefully preserved traditions into garbled remnants of someone else's story. Indigenous voices were silenced or appropriated to support Western theories. The oral traditions of Oceania deserve respect and careful study. Scholars now recognize that these traditions often preserve accurate historical information. Genealogies match archaeological evidence. Migration stories correspond to linguistic and genetic data. Place names and navigation directions can be verified. These aren't primitive myths waiting for Western interpretation. They're sophisticated systems for preserving and transmitting knowledge. Modern Pacific Islander scholars and cultural practitioners work to reclaim these narratives. They document oral traditions with elder speakers. They connect traditional knowledge with archaeological findings. They demonstrate the depth and accuracy of their own historical understanding. They don't need Mu to explain their ancestors' accomplishments. The genuine traditions of the Pacific tell a more remarkable story than any invented continent could provide. They describe human courage and skill. They preserve knowledge of one of history's greatest maritime achievements. They connect living communities to ancestors who mastered the world's largest ocean. That true history deserves to be heard without the distortion of Mu myths imposed upon it. The Stone Enigmas, Nan Madol, and the City on a Coral Reef. Off the southeastern shore of Pohnpei in Micronesia lies one of the Pacific's most mysterious archaeological sites. Artificial islands rise from a lagoon, massive basalt walls enclose plazas and chambers, canals wind between the structures like streets in a waterborne city. This is Nan Madol, and it has captivated visitors since Europeans first encountered it in the 19th century. The ruins cover about 200 acres. Nearly 100 artificial islands were constructed by piling basalt boulders and filling the spaces with coral rubble. The largest stones weigh several tons. They were quarried from a volcanic outcrop on the opposite side of Pohnpei, then transported to the reef and somehow lifted into place. The engineering required was formidable. The site's centerpiece, Nan Duas, features walls 40 feet high. Basalt columns, hexagonal in cross-section like oversized pencils, were stacked horizontally to create the massive enclosure. The precision of the construction is remarkable. No mortar binds the stones, yet they fit together tightly. The walls have stood for centuries despite typhoons and earthquakes. Early Western visitors struggled to explain Nan Madol. How could primitive islanders build such a place? Where did they get the knowledge? The theories began almost immediately. Some suggested Egyptian influence. Others claimed Phoenician traders taught the islanders. When Churchward's books appeared, promoters of Mu quickly added Nan Madol to their list of evidence. The ruins were, they claimed, a remnant of Mu itself, or perhaps a colony established by survivors. The basalt construction supposedly matched building techniques from the sunken continent. The site's antiquity must stretch back thousands of years. Only an advanced civilization could have created such structures. The reality, revealed through archaeological work and oral tradition, is both more mundane and more impressive. Nan Madol was built by the Saudeleur dynasty between roughly 1200 and 1600 CE. That's medieval times in European chronology, not the ancient past. The builders were the ancestors of modern Pohnpeians, not refugees from a lost continent. The Saudeleur united Pohnpei's previously independent chiefdoms under a single rule. They chose the reef location for Nan Madol deliberately. It provided defense against attack. It demonstrated their power through monumental architecture. It separated the ruling class from the common people who lived on the main island. The site served as a ceremonial and administrative center, not a city in the usual sense. The construction methods, while impressive, required no lost wisdom. The basalt columns formed naturally when lava cooled. Pohnpei is volcanic. These columnar basalts appeared in exposed cliffs. Workers quarried them using stone tools and fire. They transported the stones on rafts, taking advantage of high tides to move through the reef. Once at the site, they used ramps of coral rubble to raise the stones into position. We know this because Pohnpeian oral tradition preserved the information. Elders maintained detailed accounts of the construction. They described the labor organization. They named the title holders who oversaw different aspects of the work. These weren't vague legends about magic. They were practical descriptions of engineering projects. The Sotalur dynasty ruled for perhaps 16 generations. The rulers became increasingly tyrannical, according to tradition. They demanded heavy tribute from the common people. They restricted access to certain foods and areas. Eventually, a warrior from Khosrai, an island to the east, invaded Pohnpei. His name was Geological. He defeated the last Saudelur and established a new ruling system that governed until European contact. This transition appears in the archaeological record. The site shows periods of construction and abandonment. The style of some structures differs from others, suggesting different builders or purposes. Radiocarbon dating confirms the medieval chronology. Nothing about Nan Madol requires extraordinary antiquity, yet the myths persisted. Books and documentaries continued to present Nan Madol as inexplicable. They emphasized the mystery while ignoring or dismissing the archaeological findings. They quoted Western visitors' amazement while overlooking local knowledge. They made the implicit assumption that Pacific Islanders couldn't have built such structures without outside help. This reflects a broader pattern in how Western culture approached oceanic archaeology. Impressive monuments in Egypt, Greece, or Rome were attributed to those civilizations' genius. But similar achievements in the Pacific demanded supernatural or extraterrestrial explanations. The double standard revealed underlying assumptions about race and capability. The basalt columns themselves became a focus of speculation. Their geometric regularity seemed too perfect to be natural. Surely advanced technology had shaped them. In fact, columnar basalt forms naturally throughout volcanic regions. The Giant's Causeway in Ireland displays similar formations. Devil's Tower in North America is essentially a massive outcrop of columnar basalt. The process is well understood. As lava cools, it contracts, forming regular cracks that produce hexagonal columns. Some visitors to Nan Madol reported feeling unusual energy or sensing a mystical presence. These subjective experiences became evidence of the site's connection to ancient powers. But personal feelings don't constitute archaeological proof. Many people report similar sensations at various ancient sites. The power of place is real, but it comes from the site's genuine history and the dedication of those who built it, not from lost continents. The ruins face serious conservation challenges. The basalt is weathering. Vegetation grows between the stones, pushing them apart. Rising sea levels threaten the structures. Funding for preservation is limited. These are the real concerns at Nan Madol. They deserve attention more than speculative theories about Mu. Modern Pohnpeians maintain a complex relationship with Nan Madol. It's a source of cultural pride. It demonstrates their ancestors' capabilities, but it's also associated with the Saudelur's oppression. The site carries historical weight that outsiders often miss when they're busy imagining lost continents. Nan Madol doesn't need Mu to be remarkable. A medieval Pacific society built a ceremonial complex on an artificial archipelago. They moved multi-ton stones without metal tools or wheeled vehicles. They created architecture that has endured for 8 centuries. They developed social and political structures capable of organizing major public works. That's the real story. That's the achievement worth celebrating. The site stands as testament to Micronesian ingenuity and determination. It proves that ancient Pacific peoples were sophisticated engineers and architects. It demonstrates the power of organized labor and centralized authority. Most importantly, it shows that we don't need to invoke vanished super-civilizations to explain human achievement. The stones of Nan Madol speak clearly. if we listen without preconceptions. They tell of ambition and power. They record generations of work. They mark the rise and fall of a dynasty. They connect modern Pohnpeians to their ancestors. That's the story written in basalt on a coral reef. No lost continent required. Giants of Stone, the Moai of Rapa Nui, Easter Island. 1,000 Moai stand watch over Rapa Nui. Some gaze inland from coastal platforms. Others lie incomplete in the quarry where workers carved them. A few lean at odd angles, toppled by conflict or time. These massive stone figures have become icons of ancient mystery. They've also become central to myths about lost civilizations. Rapa Nui sits among the most isolated inhabited places on Earth. The nearest populated land is over 1,000 miles away. This tiny island, roughly triangular in shape, covers only 64 square miles. Yet its people created one of the Pacific's most distinctive cultures. The Moai are their most visible legacy. The statues represent ancestors. They embody the spiritual power called mana. When properly installed on ceremonial platforms called ahu, the Moai faced inland, watching over their descendants. Their backs turned to the sea. This orientation is significant. The Moai weren't scanning the horizon for ships from Mu. They were protecting the living from their positions on the boundary between the human world and the realm of the sacred. The carving took place primarily at Rano-Raraku, a volcanic crater whose stone proved ideal for sculpture. Workers used basalt tools to slowly chip away the surrounding rock, creating the statue in high relief against the quarry face. The distinctive style emerged over generations. Large heads with prominent brows, straight noses, thin lips, arms held close to the body with hands on the belly. The proportions became standardized even as sizes varied dramatically. The average Moai stands about 13 feet tall and weighs 14 tons. But the largest completed statue, called Paro, measures 32 feet and weighs 82 tons. Incomplete figures in the quarry suggest even more ambitious projects. One unfinished Moai would have stood over 70 feet tall. The fact that workers abandoned it partway through carving tells us something about the limits they eventually encountered. Once carved, the Moai had to be moved. This challenge has generated countless theories. How did people without wheels or large animals transport multi-ton statues across the island? The answer, like many archaeological puzzles, combines evidence from multiple sources. Rapa Nui oral tradition says the Moai walked to their destinations. Western scholars initially dismissed this as legend. Surely the statues must have been dragged horizontally on sleds or rolled on logs. Experiments with these methods achieved limited success. They required enormous numbers of workers and caused significant damage to replicas. Then researchers tried taking the oral tradition seriously. If the Moai walked, perhaps they were moved upright. Experiments demonstrated that a D-shaped base allows a statue to be rocked from side to side while ropes guide it forward. The Moai waddles like a refrigerator, being moved by two people. The method works remarkably well. It requires fewer workers than horizontal transport. It matches the wear patterns on the bases of actual Moai. The ancestors were right. The statues did walk. Erecting the Moai on their platforms required equal ingenuity. The current theory, based on experimental archaeology, suggests workers used ramps to gradually lever the statue upright. They built a ramp of stones behind the platform. They tilted the Moai onto its base using ropes and leverage. Then they removed the ramp stones. This method leaves archaeological traces that match what's found at Ahu sites. The Moai originally had white coral eyes with black obsidian or red scoria pupils. Only a few of these eyes survive, but they transform our understanding of the statues. With eyes in place, the Moai seem alive. They watch. They see. Their power becomes apparent. This detail is often omitted from popular depictions, which show blank-faced giants. But the eyes matter. They complete the sculpture's purpose. At the height of Moai construction, between 1200 and 1500 CE, the island's society was flourishing. The population may have reached 15,000. The land had been cleared for agriculture. Sweet potatoes provided the primary food source. Chickens supplemented the diet. Ocean fishing remained important. The island was divided between competing clans, each building ever larger Moai to demonstrate their power and honor their ancestors. Then the society collapsed. By the time Europeans arrived in 1722, the population had crashed. Many Moai had been toppled. The island was largely barren of trees. The inhabitants appeared to be struggling. What happened? For decades, this collapse was attributed to environmental catastrophe. The story went that Rapa Nui's people cut down all their trees to move moai. Without trees, they couldn't build canoes. Without canoes, they couldn't fish effectively. Erosion destroyed farmland, society descended into warfare and even cannibalism. The island became a cautionary tale about environmental destruction. More recent research complicates this narrative. Yes, the island's forests were cleared, but rats introduced by the first settlers consumed palm seeds and prevented forest regeneration. Climate changes affected rainfall and agriculture. Most devastatingly, European contact brought disease. Smallpox and other illnesses decimated the population. Peruvian slavers kidnapped many survivors in 1862. By 1877, only about 100 Rapa Nui remained alive. The Moai toppling occurred during a period of social upheaval called the Huri Moai. Rival clans deliberately pushed over each other's statues. This happened primarily in the 18th and 19th centuries during the population collapse. It wasn't random vandalism. It was targeted destruction meant to eliminate the spiritual power of opposing groups. None of this history requires Mu. The Rapa Nui people arrived as part of the broader Polynesian expansion, probably from the Marquesas or Mangariva sometime between 800 and 1200 CE. They brought the cultural traditions that would develop into the distinctive Rapa Nui style. The Moai emerged from this cultural evolution. They represent an indigenous artistic tradition reaching its peak expression. Yet the Moai became central to lost continent theories. Their scale seemed to demand explanation. Their number suggested a larger civilization. The island's isolation implied they must be remnants of something greater. Churchward and his followers pointed to Rapa Nui as obvious proof of Mu's former existence. This interpretation robbed the Rapa Nui people of their achievement. It suggested they were merely copying designs from a lost civilization rather than creating their own culture. It implied they couldn't possibly have developed such sophisticated stoneworking independently. It denied them credit for one of history's most remarkable artistic traditions. The truth is more impressive than the myth. A small population on an isolated island developed unique cultural practices. They perfected techniques for carving, moving, and erecting massive stone sculptures. They created a tradition that lasted for generations. They built hundreds of monuments that still stand today. All of this they accomplished through their own ingenuity, their own labor, and their own spiritual vision. The Moai don't point to a lost continent. They point to Rapa Nui itself, to the quarry where workers sang while they carved, to the paths where teams walked the statues to their destinations, to the platforms where clans gathered to honor their ancestors, to the living culture that created them and the descendants who preserve their memory. Rapa Nui faced genuine tragedy. European contact devastated the population. Cultural knowledge was lost. Traditional practices were suppressed. But the Rapa Nui survived. Today, they work to preserve and revitalize their heritage. They study the Moai using both traditional knowledge and modern archaeology. They share their history on their own terms. The giants of stone remain. They've weathered centuries of wind and rain. They've survived colonization and exploitation. They've endured being used as props for someone else's theories. And they still stand, facing inland, watching over the land and the people who made them. That's the real story of the Moai. That's the mystery worth preserving. The Lapita Horizon, the true pioneers of the Pacific now. 3,000 years ago, people began an expansion that would ultimately settle thousands of islands across the Pacific Ocean. They moved east from what is now Taiwan and the Philippines, island hopping through Melanesia, then pushing into the remote reaches of the Pacific where no humans had ventured before. They left a distinctive trail. Pottery, decorated with geometric patterns pressed into the clay before firing. Archaeologists call these people the Lapita culture, named after a site in New Caledonia where their distinctive pottery was first identified in the 1950s. But Lapita is an archaeological label, not what these people called themselves. They were the ancestors of modern Polynesians, Micronesians, and many Melanesian peoples. They accomplished one of humanity's most impressive feats of exploration and settlement. The Lapita expansion began around 1600 BCE in the Bismarck Archipelago, near what is now Papua New Guinea. These were accomplished seafarers who had already mastered navigation between islands. They built ocean-going canoes capable of carrying families, supplies, and domesticated animals. They developed navigation techniques that allowed them to find distant islands and, crucially, to return home and report their discoveries. The pottery they created serves as a marker for archaeologists. Lapita pots were decorated with intricate geometric designs. Dentate stamping, pressing a toothed tool into wet clay, created patterns of lines, curves, and complex motifs. Some designs appear to have cultural or spiritual significance. The pottery style is distinctive enough that archaeologists can identify Lapita sites immediately. But the Lapita people were more than potters. They brought a complete cultural package to each new island. They carried domesticated pigs, chickens, and dogs. They transported edible plants, taro, yams, breadfruit, coconuts, and bananas. They brought tools made from stone, shell, and bone. They established networks of trade and exchange that connected islands across thousands of miles. The expansion proceeded in a distinctive pattern. The Lapita would settle islands where they could apply their agricultural system. They favored larger islands with good soil and fresh water. They established villages, usually near the coast. Then they would continue exploring, sending expeditions to find and settle new lands. By 1500 BCE, Lapita settlements stretched from the Bismarck Archipelago to the Solomon Islands. By 1300 BCE, they'd reached Vanuatu. By 1100 BCE, New Caledonia and Fiji. Around 900 BCE, they arrived in Tonga and Samoa. These dates come from radiocarbon analysis of archaeological sites. The expansion happened over centuries, but it was continuous and deliberate. The Lapita developed seafaring technology suited to Pacific conditions. Their canoes used double hull or outrigger designs for stability. Sails made from woven pandanus leaves caught the trade winds. Hulls were constructed by lashing planks together with coconut fiber rope, creating vessels that were both strong and flexible. These canoes could carry dozens of people plus supplies for long voyages. The linguistic evidence confirms the archaeological picture. The Austronesian language family includes languages from Madagascar to Rapa Nui. Linguists can trace how these languages diverged from common ancestors. The patterns match the archaeological evidence for Lapita. For canoe, sail, fishing techniques, and navigational concepts appear across the language family, showing shared maritime heritage. Genetic studies add another line of evidence. DNA from modern Pacific Islanders shows clear connections to populations in Taiwan and island Southeast Asia. The maternal lineages, traced through mitochondrial DNA, and paternal lineages, traced through Y chromosomes, both point to a migration out of Southeast Asia. The genetic diversity decreases as you move east, consistent with successive waves of settlement from a Western source. When the Lapita reached the Fiji-Tonga-Samoa region, something significant happened. This area became a homeland for what would develop into distinctly Polynesian culture. The archaeological record shows a transition. Lapita pottery gradually disappeared. New cultural practices emerged. The people who settled these islands would eventually launch the next wave of expansion into central and eastern Polynesia. But there was a pause. For perhaps 1,000 years, the expansion stopped at the edge of western Polynesia. The islands of central Polynesia remained uninhabited. The reasons for this pause are debated. Perhaps the Lapita needed time to develop new technologies for reaching more distant islands. Perhaps they were adapting to their new environments. Perhaps social or environmental factors made further expansion difficult. Whatever the cause, around 900 CE, the expansion resumed. Polynesians voyaged into the vast empty reaches of the Central Pacific. They discovered and settled the Society Islands, the Marquesas, and the Cook Islands. From these bases, they pushed even further. Hawaii was settled sometime between 1000 and 1200 CE. Rapa Nui probably around 1200 CE. Aotearoa, New Zealand, perhaps as late as 1300 CE. This second wave of expansion was even more remarkable than the first. The distances were greater. The navigation required was more sophisticated. Many islands lie isolated by thousands of miles of open ocean. Finding them required skill, courage, and probably some luck. But find them, the Polynesians did. The Lapita people and their descendants accomplished all of this without compasses, sextants, or written navigational charts. They didn't need Mu to teach them. They developed their seafaring traditions through generations of experience, observation, and accumulated knowledge. Each successful voyage added to the collective wisdom. Each generation refined the techniques passed down from their ancestors. The trail of Lapita pottery and its associated cultural remains provides clear evidence for how the Pacific was settled. It shows a west to east expansion from a Southeast Asian origin. It documents the gradual spread of people, plants, animals, and technology across thousands of miles of ocean. It proves that Pacific Islanders are not remnants of a sunken civilization, but the descendants of history's greatest navigators. This is the real origin story of Pacific peoples. Not refugees from catastrophe, but bold explorers seeking new lands. Not the degenerate survivors of a lost golden age, but the inheritors of maritime traditions refined over millennia. The Lapita Horizon marks the beginning of an achievement that would, over 3,000 years, see humans settle every habitable island in the world's largest ocean. That achievement needs no embellishment. It stands on its own as one of humanity's greatest accomplishments. The true pioneers of the Pacific wrote their story in pottery shards and stone tools, in language and genes, in the simple fact of human presence on islands that had known no people before. That story is more wondrous than any tale of Mu. Wayfinders, the astonishing science of Polynesian navigation. Picture yourself in a small canoe in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. No land is visible in any direction. The horizon forms a perfect circle of blue meeting blue. You have no compass, no GPS, no instruments of any kind. Your task is to find an island you've never seen, perhaps only a few miles across, lying somewhere in millions of square miles of ocean. This was the challenge Polynesian navigators faced and mastered. Western observers initially assumed Pacific settlement must have been accidental. People fishing near shore were blown off course. Currents carried them to distant islands. Settlement happened through random chance, but not deliberate exploration. This theory persisted for decades. It was easier for European scholars to imagine accident than to credit indigenous peoples with sophisticated navigation. Thor Heyerdahl's Kon-Tiki expedition in 1947 seemed to support the drift theory. Heyerdahl sailed a balsa raft from South America to Polynesia, proving such a journey was possible. He argued this explained Polynesian origins. The theory had problems. Linguistic, genetic, and cultural evidence all contradicted it, but it captured public imagination. Heyerdahl's book became a bestseller. The idea that Polynesians drifted to their islands rather than sailing deliberately became widespread. Then in the 1970s, scholars began taking traditional navigation seriously. They worked with master navigators, particularly from the Caroline Islands in Micronesia, where traditional navigation practices had survived. These navigators possessed knowledge that challenged everything Western science assumed about pre-modern seafaring. The navigators read the ocean itself. They studied wave patterns. Swells moving across the ocean bend around islands. A skilled navigator can detect these refracted swells from dozens of miles away. Different wave types, local wind waves, larger swells from distant storms, create a pattern. The navigator learns to feel these patterns through the motion of the canoe. Stars provided the primary compass. Polynesian navigators memorized the rising and setting points of dozens of stars along the horizon. These points change with latitude but remain consistent enough for practical navigation. By keeping specific stars on a particular side of the canoe, navigators maintained direction. As one star rose too high, another would appear at the appropriate point. The star path could be followed all night. The sun's path marked directions during the day. Its rising and setting points shift with seasons, but experienced navigators accounted for this. The sun's height at noon gave latitude information. Clouds also provided clues. Certain cloud types form over land. Their greenish undersides reflect lagoon water. A stationary cloud on the horizon often marked an island. Birds served as guides near land. Different species have different ranges from shore. Terns might venture 40 miles out, boobies less far. A navigator approaching an island would first encounter far-ranging species, then closer to shore birds. The direction birds flew at dawn and dusk indicated land's location. They leave to feed at sea in the morning and return to roost at sunset. Ocean color changed near islands. Deep ocean appears dark blue. Shallow water near land shows lighter colors, turquoise over sand, green over reef. At night, the ocean's bioluminescence increased near shallow areas. Navigators watched for these subtle shifts in water appearance. Knowledge of fish and marine life helped identify fishing grounds and approximate locations. Certain species frequented specific areas. Flotsam patterns suggested currents and proximity to land. Even ocean smell provided information. Land has a distinct scent that carries downwind across many miles. This knowledge wasn't written down. It was transmitted orally from master to student. Training began in childhood. Young apprentices learned star courses, wave patterns, and navigational lore through chance, hands-on experience, and years of observation. A master navigator held encyclopedic knowledge in memory, hundreds of star courses, typical weather patterns, island locations relative to one another. In 1976, a reconstructed double-hulled voyaging canoe called Hokulea sailed from Hawaii to Tahiti using traditional navigation. The navigator, Mau Pielug from Satawal in Micronesia, guided the canoe over 2,400 miles of open ocean without instruments. The voyage succeeded. It proved that intentional long-distance navigation was not only possible, but practical. Hokulea's success sparked a revival of traditional navigation and voyaging throughout Polynesia. New canoes were built. Young people trained in traditional methods. The Polynesian Voyaging Society conducted numerous voyages, reconstructing ancient routes and demonstrating indigenous navigation techniques. These weren't academic exercises. They were acts of cultural reclamation. The navigational knowledge also revealed sophisticated understanding of oceanography and astronomy. Polynesians had mapped the Pacific in their minds. They knew typical voyage lengths between islands. They understood seasonal weather patterns and how they affected sailing. They identified zones where particular stars would guide them towards specific destinations. The navigation required probabilistic thinking. A navigator aimed for a general area, knowing that once close enough, signs would reveal the exact island location. This strategy, called target expansion, used island chains advantageously. Missing one island meant encountering another nearby. The technique turned the ocean's vastness from obstacle into tool. Return voyages were crucial. Exploration meant little without the ability to return home and report discoveries. Polynesian navigation allowed two-way travel. A successful navigator could retrace routes, guide others to new islands, and maintain contacts across vast distances. This enabled the trade networks and cultural connections that spanned the Pacific. The sophistication of this system challenged Western assumptions about indigenous knowledge. European navigation relied on instruments and written materials. The idea that someone could cross oceans through observation and memory seemed impossible. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Polynesian navigators had done exactly that, repeatedly, for over 1,000 years. This achievement required no instruction from a lost continent. It developed through observation and experience. Early seafarers noticed patterns. They experimented with different techniques. Successful methods were remembered and taught. Failed approaches were abandoned. Over many generations, this produced a navigational system perfectly adapted to Pacific conditions. The wayfinders of Polynesia were scientists in the truest sense. They observed natural phenomena. They developed theories about how the ocean worked. They tested those theories through practice. They refined their understanding based on results. The knowledge they accumulated was empirical, practical, and remarkably accurate. Modern Pacific Islanders have every reason to be proud of this heritage. Their ancestors didn't stumble onto islands by accident. They didn't follow instructions from a vanished civilization. They observed, learned, experimented, and succeeded through their own intelligence and determination. They solved one of history's greatest navigational challenges, using tools they created and knowledge they developed themselves. The revival of traditional navigation today isn't just about preserving the past, it's about reclaiming a narrative. It asserts that Pacific peoples possess sophisticated scientific knowledge developed through their own intellectual traditions. It challenges the notion that indigenous people needed outside help to achieve remarkable things. It proves that human ingenuity flourishes in all cultures, producing solutions perfectly adapted to local conditions. The wayfinders navigated by watching the world around them. They understood that nature provides all the information needed for those who learn to read it. That knowledge, passed down through generations and now being revitalized, is the real treasure of the Pacific. Not a lost continent's forgotten wisdom, but living traditions maintained by real people who never needed Mu to be extraordinary. A continent drowned in time, Sunda and Sahul. The Pacific holds no sunken continent called Mu. But the stories of lost lands are not entirely fiction. They are echoes of something real, something that truly happened. During the last ice age, sea levels fell dramatically. Water locked itself into vast ice sheets covering much of the northern hemisphere. The ocean retreated, exposing land that had been submerged for millennia. In two regions of the Indo-Pacific, this created enormous continental shelves that became home to countless generations of humans. The first of these lost lands was Sunda. This vast expanse connected what we now call the islands of Southeast Asia into a single massive landmass. Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and the Malay Peninsula were not islands at all. They formed one continuous territory, roughly the size of India. Archaeological evidence shows humans lived across this region for tens of thousands of years. They hunted, gathered, and eventually developed early forms of agriculture. Rivers flowed across plains that are now deep beneath the Java Sea and the Gulf of Thailand. Forests covered valleys that today lie under hundreds of feet of water. To the east lay Sahul. This was an even larger continent, uniting Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania into a single landmass. The Torres Strait did not exist. The Arafura Sea was dry land. Humans crossed from Sunda to Sahul at least 60,000 years ago, making one of humanity's earliest ocean voyages. They settled across this vast territory, adapting to its diverse environments from tropical rainforests to arid deserts. Then came the melt. Starting around 20,000 years ago, global temperatures began to rise. The ice sheets retreated, water returned to the oceans, sea levels rose steadily, then rapidly. Over the course of several thousand years, the ocean claimed back the land. Sunda fragmented into thousands of islands. Sahul split into three. Coastlines retreated inland by hundreds of miles. River valleys became straits. Plains became shallow seas. This was not a single catastrophic event. It happened over many human lifetimes. But from the perspective of oral tradition, passed down through generations, it would have seemed like the world itself was changing. Grandparents told stories of lands that no longer existed. Fishing grounds became open ocean. Ancient campsites vanished beneath the waves. Entire populations had to migrate inland, competing for resources in increasingly crowded highlands. The flooding of Sunda and Sahul displaced millions of people over thousands of years. Communities that had lived on coastal plains for countless generations found their world shrinking. The sea advanced relentlessly. Some areas flooded quickly in geological terms, rising several meters per century. Others succumbed more slowly, but just as inevitably. Archaeological sites from this period tell a story of constant adaptation and movement. Modern research using seafloor mapping has revealed the topography of these drowned lands. Scientists can now trace ancient river systems running beneath the Java Sea. They can identify what were once coastal plains, now lying 50 meters below the surface. Core samples from the ocean floor contain pollen and sediments that reveal what plants grew on these lands before the flood. The picture that emerges is of a rich, diverse landscape that supported substantial human populations. Some researchers have suggested these ancient floodings might explain the prevalence of deluge myths across cultures. The idea is controversial but intriguing. If stories could be passed down for thousands of years through oral tradition, then memories of the post-glacial flooding might have survived in mythic form. Australian Aboriginal traditions speak of times when the sea was far away, when land connected islands. Torres Strait Islander stories tell of the sea rushing in to separate their islands from the mainland. Genetic evidence supports the timeline of these events. Studies of indigenous Australian and Papuan populations show their ancestors arrived when Sahul was still united. Southeast Asian genetics reveal complex patterns of migration and mixture as Sunda fragmented. The DNA trail matches the archaeological record, confirming that humans witnessed and adapted to these dramatic environmental changes. The loss of Sunda and Sahul represents the largest disappearance of habitable land in human history. Roughly 2 million square kilometers vanished beneath the waves. This is an area larger than Mexico. Thousands of archaeological sites, potentially containing invaluable information about early human societies, now lie on the ocean floor. They are inaccessible to conventional archaeology, preserved but hidden in the sediments of shallow seas. This is the real story of lost continents in the Pacific region. Not an advanced civilization swallowed by the sea in a single night, but a slow transformation that reshaped the geography of an entire region. The stories of Mu may be fiction, but the human experience of watching the ocean reclaim vast territories is historical fact. The difference is one of scale and sophistication. The lands that were lost supported hunter-gatherers and early agriculturalists, not advanced civilizations with written languages and monumental architecture. But their loss was no less significant to the people who lived through it. Their descendants carried forward the memory, transformed through countless retellings into the myths we still hear today. Echoes in clay and bone, the archaeological record of Oceania. The settlement of the Pacific represents one of humanity's greatest achievements. To understand what really happened requires looking at the evidence, not ancient tablets or mystical revelations, but the physical traces left behind by the actual people who made these incredible journeys. The archaeological record of Oceania tells a story far more remarkable than any myth of Mu. The trail begins in Taiwan, roughly 5,000 years ago. Here, archaeological sites show the development of a distinct culture. These people made a particular style of pottery, finely made and often decorated with intricate designs. They cultivated rice, millet, and root crops. They kept pigs and chickens. They built boats sophisticated enough for ocean voyages. These were the ancestors of the Austronesian peoples, and their expansion across the Pacific would be one of the great migrations in human history. From Taiwan, they moved south into the Philippines. Sites dated to around 4,000 years ago show the same cultural markers: the pottery, the crops, the animals. Then they pushed further, reaching the coasts of Borneo and Sulawesi. The archaeological evidence tracks their progress through the careful dating of pottery sherds, stone tools, and organic remains. Each site provides a piece of the puzzle, showing when people arrived and what they brought with them. Around 3,500 years ago, these maritime peoples reached the Bismarck Archipelago and the Solomon Islands in Melanesia. Here, the archaeological record becomes particularly rich. Sites contain not just pottery, but elaborate shell ornaments, obsidian tools traded from distant sources, and remains of the plants and animals they introduced. These people did not simply pass through, they settled, establishing communities that would persist for generations. The pottery these people made is distinctive. Archaeologists call it lapidoware, after the site in New Caledonia where it was first identified. The designs are geometric and complex, created by pressing toothed stamps into the clay before firing. Each region developed its own variations, allowing researchers to track the spread of these people across the Pacific. Lapita pottery is the archaeological signature of the first settlers of remote Oceania. But pottery alone does not tell the whole story. The bones of animals provide crucial evidence. Chickens appear in sites across the Pacific, descended from birds domesticated in Southeast Asia. Pigs and dogs followed the same route. These were not wild animals. They were deliberately transported on long ocean voyages, which means the settlers came with intention to establish permanent communities. You do not bring breeding pairs of domesticated animals on a random drift voyage. Plant remains add another layer of understanding. Carbonized seeds and pollen analysis show what crops these people cultivated. Taro, yam, breadfruit, and banana appear in sites across Oceania, all introduced by the Lapita peoples and their descendants. These were not native plants, but imports from Southeast Asia and near Oceania. Their presence proves deliberate colonization, not accidental discovery. Stone tools provide evidence of trade networks spanning thousands of kilometers. Obsidian, a volcanic glass prized for making sharp cutting tools, appears in sites far from its source. Chemical analysis can identify which volcano produced a particular piece of obsidian. Studies have shown that obsidian from sources in the Bismarcks traveled hundreds of miles to other islands. This indicates regular contact and exchange between communities separated by open ocean. The chronology of settlement can be reconstructed with remarkable precision. Radiocarbon dating of charcoal, bone, and shell from archaeological sites provides absolute dates. The pattern is clear. The Bismarck Archipelago was settled by 3,300 years ago, Fiji and Tonga by 3,000 years ago, Samoa by 2,800 years ago. Then came a pause, a period archaeologists call the Long Pause, lasting roughly 1,000 years before the final push into eastern Polynesia. During this long pause, populations consolidated in western Polynesia. The archaeological record shows the development of distinctively Polynesian cultural traits. The pottery tradition gradually disappeared, new forms of stone tools emerged, fishhooks changed in style, social structures became more complex, as evidenced by increasingly elaborate burial practices and the construction of ceremonial structures. Around 1,000 years ago, the expansion resumed. The Society Islands, the Marquesas, and Hawaii were settled in rapid succession. New Zealand, the largest landmass in Polynesia, was reached last probably around 700 years ago. The archaeological evidence for these late settlements is abundant and clear. Radiocarbon dates, cultural remains, and even the bones of the extinct moa birds hunted by the first arrivals all point to this relatively recent colonization. Human remains themselves provide vital information. Skeletal analysis reveals the health, diet, and genetic ancestry of ancient Pacific peoples. Teeth show patterns of wear consistent with the foods these populations ate. Bones reveal evidence of the physical labor required in island life, from paddling canoes to clearing forests. Burial practices evolved over time, from simple interments to elaborate tombs that reflect increasingly stratified societies. The archaeological record contradicts every claim made about Mu. There is no evidence of a pre-existing advanced civilization in the Pacific. No ruins that predate the Lapita expansion. No artifacts that cannot be explained by the steady documented movement of Austronesian peoples across the ocean. Every site, every artifact, every bone fits into a coherent narrative of human migration from west to east, from Southeast Asia to the remotest islands. This is not a story of mystery. It is a story of method. Patient excavation, careful analysis, and rigorous dating have revealed the true history of Pacific settlement. The evidence is overwhelming and mutually reinforcing. Pottery styles, genetic markers, linguistic relationships, and absolute dates all tell the same story. The peopling of the Pacific was an achievement of real humans, sailing real boats, carrying real animals and plants to real islands. They left behind a record written in clay and bone, waiting for archaeologists to read it. Yonaguni and the Sunken Pyramid, modern myths and geological explanations. Off the coast of Yonaguni, the westernmost island of the Ryukyu chain, lies an underwater formation that has sparked fierce debate. Discovered by a local dive operator in 1986, the Yonaguni monument appears to show straight edges, flat surfaces, and right angles. To some observers, these features suggest human construction. To them, this is evidence of an ancient civilization, possibly even a remnant of Mu. To geologists, it is something entirely different. The formation rises from the seabed in a series of terraces and platforms. The largest feature is roughly 100 meters long and 25 meters tall. Sharp corners mark the intersections of flat surfaces. What appear to be steps descend from one level to another. Channels cut through the rock in seemingly regular patterns. At first glance, especially in the limited visibility of underwater photography, the structure looks artificial. Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist from the University of the Ryukyus, has championed the artificial origin theory. He argues that the features are too regular to be natural. He points to what he interprets as roads, staircases, and even carved figures. According to his analysis, the structure could be 10,000 years old, dating to when sea levels were lower and the formation would have been above water. This would place it among the oldest architectural works in the world. His claims attracted international attention. Television documentaries featured the site, often presenting it as a genuine mystery. Books included Yonaguni as evidence for advanced prehistoric civilizations. Online forums debated the implications. If the structure was indeed artificial, it would require a fundamental rethinking of human prehistory in East Asia. The narrative was compelling. An ancient monument, now submerged, pointing to a forgotten people with sophisticated building techniques. But the majority of geologists who have examined the site reach a different conclusion. The formation, they argue, is entirely natural. It consists of sandstone, a sedimentary rock that forms in horizontal layers. Over millions of years, tectonic activity tilted and fractured these layers. The Ryukyu Islands sit on the edge of the Philippine Sea Plate, one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. Earthquakes regularly shake the area, creating fractures in the bedrock. Sandstone has a particular property that explains the Yonaguni Formation. It breaks along planes of weakness, creating flat surfaces and sharp angles. When layers of rock fracture along joint planes and bedding planes, the result can look remarkably geometric. This is not unusual. Similar formations exist on land throughout the world, from the Giant's Causeway in Ireland to the tessellated pavements of Tasmania. Natural processes create patterns that mimic human construction. Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University, visited the site and conducted a detailed examination. His assessment was clear. The features at Yonaguni are consistent with natural geological processes. The rock shows no tool marks. There are no clear signs of quarrying or shaping. The angles, while striking, are not precise enough to indicate deliberate construction. Most tellingly, the formation is continuous with the surrounding bedrock. It was not built from separate blocks, but is part of the island's natural geology. The steps can be explained by the layering of the sandstone. Differential erosion removes softer layers while leaving harder ones intact, creating a stepped appearance. The channels follow joint patterns in the rock, carved deeper by water flow over millennia. Even the features Kimura interprets as carved faces or symbols are consistent with random weathering patterns that occasionally produce shapes resembling familiar objects. This is pareidolia, the human tendency to see meaningful patterns in random data. Furthermore, no artifacts have been found at the site. No pottery, no tools, no organic remains. If humans constructed this monument and used it for any purpose, they should have left traces. Ancient buildings accumulate debris, but the waters around Yonaguni have yielded nothing that suggests human activity. The formation stands alone, lacking any supporting evidence for human involvement. The depth of the formation does correspond with lower sea levels during the last glacial period. Around 10,000 years ago, sea levels were indeed lower, and the formation would have been exposed. However, this does not prove it was built. Coastal erosion is more aggressive than submarine erosion. If anything, the formation is better preserved because it was submerged relatively early in the post-glacial sea level rise. The debate over Yonaguni reveals a pattern common in fringe archaeology. A striking natural formation is discovered. Initial observations note unusual features. Before thorough scientific analysis, speculation about artificial origin spreads through media and popular culture. Later, careful geological investigation provides a natural explanation, but the initial exciting story has more lasting power than the mundane truth. This pattern repeats across claimed evidence for Mu and similar lost civilizations. Bimini Road in the Bahamas, once proclaimed as an ancient highway, proved to be beach rock naturally fractured into rectangular blocks. The underwater structures off the coast of Cuba, announced as a possible sunken city, turned out to be geological formations. The Baltic Sea anomaly, claimed as everything from an ancient temple to a crashed UFO, is most likely a glacial deposit. Yonaguni serves as a useful case study in critical thinking. It shows the importance of expertise. A dive operator or even a marine geologist can observe interesting features underwater, but interpreting those features requires knowledge of structural geology, sedimentology, and geomorphology. It shows the importance of context. A formation cannot be evaluated in isolation, but must be understood as part of the surrounding geological environment. And it shows the importance of evidence. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. The burden of proof rests on those claiming artificial construction, not on those proposing natural origins. The formation remains a popular dive site. Tourists descend to explore its terraces and channels. They photograph the angles and marvel at the geometry. There is nothing wrong with finding natural formations beautiful or intriguing, but beauty and mystery do not equal artificiality. The earth produces wonders without human intervention. The Yonaguni Monument is one of them, a testament to the power of geology rather than to a lost civilization. The power of a myth, Mu, in pop culture, comics, and film. The continent of Mu never existed, but the idea of Mu has lived a vibrant life in the imagination. From the moment James Churchward published his books, the lost Pacific civilization captured the attention of storytellers. Writers, artists, and filmmakers recognized the narrative power of a drowned world, an ancient people, and forbidden knowledge. Throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, Mu has appeared in countless works of fiction, each adding new layers to the myth. The pulp magazines of the 1930s and 40s embraced Mu enthusiastically. These cheaply produced periodicals specialized in adventure stories set in exotic locations. Lost continents provided perfect settings for tales of exploration, conflict, and discovery. Writers like Robert E. Howard and Clark Ashton Smith referenced Mu in their stories. Howard's Conan stories mentioned the Thurian Age, a prehistoric epoch influenced by theosophical ideas of lost continents. Smith created the continent of Mu as the setting for several horror tales, placing it in a deep mythic past filled with ancient sorcery and inhuman gods. Comic books discovered Mu early. In the 1940s, superhero comics often featured hidden kingdoms and lost civilizations as plot devices. Namor the Submariner, Marvel Comics' undersea antihero, ruled Atlantis, but stories sometimes referenced other sunken lands, including Mu. As the genre evolved, Mu appeared more frequently. Jack Kirby, one of the most influential comic artists, incorporated themes of ancient astronauts and lost civilizations into his work. His Eternals series, launched in 1976, featured advanced prehistoric peoples and drew on the entire lexicon of alternative history, including Mu. Japanese popular culture developed a particularly strong fascination with Mu. In 1970, a Japanese edition of Churchward's books was published, finding an enthusiastic audience. Soon after, Mu appeared in manga and anime. Space Battleship Yamato, one of the most influential anime series of the 1970s, incorporated Mu into its mythology. The story featured the sunken continent as an ancient Earth civilization with advanced technology. This became a recurring theme in Japanese science fiction. Ancient Earth civilizations, often located in the Pacific, possessed knowledge or technology that modern humans had forgotten. Video games adopted Mu as a plot element. Japanese role-playing games in particular used lost continents as settings or backstory elements. Games like Final Fantasy and Chrono Trigger featured ancient civilizations with advanced magical or technological powers that were destroyed in cataclysms. While not always explicitly named Mu, these fictional cultures drew directly on the aesthetics and narrative structure of the Mu myth. Players explored ruins, discovered ancient secrets, and uncovered the hubris that led to these civilizations' downfall. Cinema approached Mu more cautiously. While Atlantis appeared in numerous films, Mu remained less popular on screen. This may be because Mu lacked the cultural cachet of Plato's Atlantis. Nevertheless, Mu made appearances. Low-budget adventure films of the 1950s and 60s sometimes featured Pacific Island adventures that alluded to lost civilizations. Later films dealing with ancient mysteries or alternative history occasionally referenced Mu as part of a broader tapestry of lost worlds. The myth also influenced New Age spirituality and alternative healing practices. Some claim to channel spirits from Mu or to practice healing techniques allegedly preserved from the continent. Retreat centers and workshops offered to help participants recover past life memories of living in Mu. Crystal healing practitioners sometimes asserted that certain crystals came from or were used in Mu. None of these claims had any basis in fact, but they demonstrated the adaptability of the myth to new contexts. Music embraced Mu as well. Progressive rock bands of the 1970s, drawn to mystical and mythological themes, occasionally referenced lost continents. Album covers featured dreamlike images of ancient cities and cosmic symbolism that echoed theosophical depictions of Mu. Later, electronic music and ambient genres used Mu as an aesthetic touchstone, evoking imagined soundscapes of a vanished world. The internet age brought new life to the Mu myth. Websites dedicated to alternative history featured elaborate reconstructions of Mu's supposed society, geography, and fate. Forums debated the evidence for its existence. YouTube channels produced documentaries that blended fact and speculation, presenting Mu as an open question rather than a settled matter. The democratization of publishing meant that anyone could contribute to the mythology, adding their own variations and interpretations. Contemporary fiction continues to mine Mu for inspiration. Fantasy novels use it as a historical backdrop for stories of magic and adventure. Science fiction sometimes presents Mu as an ancient spacefaring civilization that left Earth long ago. Horror writers, following the tradition established by H.P. Lovecraft, use Mu as a source of eldritch knowledge and forbidden texts. The Lost Continent serves as a flexible narrative device, adaptable to nearly any genre or medium. This cultural persistence reveals something important about myths. They do not need to be true to be powerful. Mu functions as a symbol representing lost knowledge, environmental catastrophe, and the impermanence of civilizations. It allows storytellers to explore themes of hubris, decline, and rediscovery. It provides a setting untethered to historical fact, where imagination can operate freely without the constraints of archaeological reality. The irony is that this imaginative freedom comes at a cost. The more Mu appears in popular culture, the more some people assume it must have some basis in fact. Fiction and speculation blur together, especially online where context and sourcing are often absent. A well-researched novel can be mistaken for historical analysis. An artistic interpretation can be taken as documentary evidence. The line between myth and history becomes harder to maintain. Yet there is value in understanding how myths function in culture. Mu tells us what stories appeal to us, what fears and hopes we project onto the past. The enduring popularity of Lost Continent narratives suggests a deep fascination with the possibility that earlier peoples achieved wonders we cannot match. It reflects anxiety about our own civilization's fragility, and it demonstrates the human capacity to create rich, detailed fictional worlds that feel real, even when we know they are not. The esoteric revival, Mu, in New Age and alternative archaeology. By the late 20th century, the myth of Mu found a new home in the expanding world of alternative spirituality and fringe archaeology. As mainstream academia became more rigorous in its methods and more skeptical of sensational claims, a parallel culture developed that embraced exactly the kind of speculative thinking that professional scholars rejected. Mu became a cornerstone of this alternative worldview, representing lost wisdom and suppressed knowledge. The New Age movement, which gained momentum in the 1970s and 80s, drew heavily on theosophical ideas. Blavatsky's Root Races and Lost Continents were repackaged for a new generation seeking spiritual answers outside traditional religion. Workshops and retreats offered teachings supposedly derived from ancient Lemurian or Mu wisdom. Practitioners claimed to access Akashic records, cosmic libraries containing all knowledge from every civilization that ever existed. In these records, Mu appeared as a highly evolved society with deep spiritual understanding. Past life regression became a popular practice in New Age circles. Therapists guided clients into trance states where they described previous incarnations. Many reported lives in Atlantis or Mu. These accounts were remarkably consistent, suggesting either genuine racial memory or more likely the influence of common source material like Churchward's books. Descriptions included crystal-powered cities, telepathic communication, and advanced healing techniques. The past lives almost always placed the subject in positions of privilege or spiritual authority, rarely as ordinary farmers or laborers. Alternative archaeology emerged as a distinct genre in publishing and television. Authors like Graham Hancock, though not specifically focused on Mu, popularized the idea of an advanced global civilization existing before the last ice age. This hypothetical culture supposedly possessed sophisticated astronomical knowledge, advanced construction techniques, and a worldwide network of monuments. While Hancock focused mainly on Atlantis, his work created a receptive audience for all lost civilization claims, including Mu. The alternative archaeology genre follows a predictable pattern. It begins with genuine archaeological mysteries. How were the pyramids built? How did ancient peoples move massive stones? Why do certain astronomical alignments appear in monuments worldwide? Then it proposes that conventional archaeology cannot explain these mysteries, which is false. Finally, it suggests that a lost advanced civilization provides the best explanation, which is unnecessary given that the conventional explanations are adequate. For Mu specifically, alternative historians point to Pacific monuments like Nan Madol and Easter Island as evidence. They ask how primitive peoples could have accomplished such engineering feats. The question contains a problematic assumption that Pacific Islanders were primitive. In fact, these cultures possessed sophisticated knowledge, advanced social organization, and appropriate technology for their projects. The question reveals more about the questioner's biases than about archaeological reality. The internet dramatically amplified alternative archaeology. Websites and forums allowed enthusiasts to share ideas, images, and theories without peer review or editorial oversight. YouTube became a major platform for alternative history content. Videos presenting Mu as factual could accumulate millions of views. The algorithmic nature of social media meant that viewers interested in one fringe topic would be recommended others, creating echo chambers where alternative views seemed mainstream. One particularly persistent claim links Mu to ancient aliens. This idea, popularized by authors like Erich von Däniken and television shows like Ancient Aliens, suggests that extraterrestrial visitors helped or inspired ancient civilizations. In this narrative, Mu becomes either a colony established by aliens or a human civilization given advanced technology by extraterrestrial benefactors. The cataclysm that destroyed Mu is sometimes attributed to a war between alien factions or punishment for misusing gifted technology. These theories share a common feature. They deny human agency and capability. They assume that ancient peoples, especially non-European peoples, could not have achieved their actual accomplishments without outside help. This assumption is both factually wrong and ethically troubling. It perpetuates colonial-era prejudices that portrayed indigenous peoples as incapable of sophisticated thought or achievement. The alternative archaeology community rarely acknowledges this dimension of their arguments. Commercial interests drive much of the alternative archaeology industry. Books promising to reveal suppressed history sell well. Television shows featuring ancient mysteries attract viewers. Websites generate revenue through advertising and affiliate links. There is financial incentive to make sensational claims, to promise revelations that mainstream academia supposedly hides. The more dramatic the claim, the more attention it receives, regardless of supporting evidence. Some alternative archaeology proponents position themselves as persecuted truth-tellers, challenging an academic establishment. They claim that mainstream scholars dismiss their work due to closed-mindedness or fear of paradigm shifts. This narrative has emotional appeal but does not match reality. Academic archaeology is constantly revising its understanding based on new evidence. What the mainstream rejects is not new ideas, but unsubstantiated claims presented without rigorous methodology. The actual suppression, when it occurs, flows in the opposite direction. Alternative theories about Mu and similar lost civilizations suppress and overshadow the real history of the Pacific. They draw attention away from the genuine achievements of Polynesian navigators, Lapita potters, and Rapa Nui engineers. They substitute fantasy for the remarkable story of how humans actually settled the world's largest ocean. The true history is more impressive than the myth, but it requires more effort to understand. New Age and alternative archaeology treatments of Mu also tend to romanticize catastrophe. The destruction of Mu is presented as tragic, but also purifying, a necessary reset. Some versions suggest that survivors scattered across the world, seeding new civilizations with fragments of their knowledge. This narrative serves a particular psychological function, offering hope that even after civilizational collapse, wisdom can survive and eventually return. In an era of climate change and environmental destruction, such myths provide comfort, even as they distract from the actual challenges we face. Educational initiatives have struggled to counter these narratives effectively. Documentary filmmakers attempting to present accurate Pacific history compete against well-funded alternative archaeology content. Teachers face students who have absorbed misinformation from online sources. Museums and cultural centers must actively debunk myths while presenting evidence-based archaeology. The task is ongoing and difficult, requiring both scientific literacy and media literacy. The persistence of Mu in esoteric and alternative circles demonstrates the enduring appeal of lost civilization narratives. They offer simple explanations for complex phenomena. They provide a sense of hidden knowledge and special insight. They create communities of believers who share a worldview distinct from mainstream society. These social and psychological functions ensure that Mu will continue to appear in alternative literature, regardless of the archaeological evidence against it. The linguistic fallacy, lost mother tongues and pseudo-translation language, was central to both Le Plongeon's and Churchward's arguments for Mu. Both claimed that linguistic evidence proved the existence of a mother civilization. By finding supposed similarities between words in widely separated languages, they argued for ancient connections and a common origin. Their methods appeared scholarly, filled with lists of words and comparative tables. But their linguistics was fundamentally flawed, based on coincidence and imagination rather than rigorous analysis. Le Plongeon claimed he could translate Mayan inscriptions and found references to Mu. His translations were creative fiction. He had no training in Mayan languages and ignored the work of actual Maya scholars. He cherry-picked symbols, assigned them values based on his preconceptions, and produced English sentences that supported his theories. Modern Mayan epigraphy, built on decades of careful comparative work, shows that Le Plongeon's translations bore no relation to what the text actually said. The Maya wrote about their kings, their wars, their calendar, and their gods. They did not write about a lost continent in the Pacific. Churchward took a different approach, but with equally invalid methods. He compiled lists of words from various Pacific languages, Sanskrit, Greek, and others, looking for similarities. When he found words that sounded alike, he claimed they derived from a common source, the language of Mu. This method ignores how language actually works. Languages change over time through regular sound shifts and grammatical evolution. Linguists can trace these changes and determine genuine relationships between languages. Churchward did neither. The coincidental similarity of words across languages is inevitable given the limited number of sounds humans can produce and the vast number of words in existence. This is called false cognates. The Japanese word for much is takusan, which sounds similar to dozen in English. They are completely unrelated. English bad and Persian bad sound identical but mean different things and have different origins. English much and Spanish mucho seem related and actually are, both descending from Latin, but you need systematic comparison to prove such connections, not just surface similarity. Genuine linguistic relationships are established through the comparative method. Linguists compare entire vocabularies, looking for regular patterns of sound correspondence. For example, many words beginning with F in English correspond to words beginning with P in Latin. Father and pater, fish and piscis, foot and pedis. This regular pattern indicates a historical relationship. Both languages descend from Proto-Indo-European. Irregular or random similarities prove nothing. The languages of the Pacific do show genuine relationships, but they tell a completely different story than Mu. The Austronesian language family includes hundreds of languages spoken from Madagascar to Easter Island. Linguists have traced their relationships and reconstructed their common ancestor, Proto-Austronesian. The evidence shows these languages originated in Taiwan and spread south and east with migrating populations. The linguistic tree matches the archaeological record and genetic data. All three lines of evidence confirm the same pattern of settlement. Specific words reveal this history. The Proto-Austronesian word for outrigger canoe can be reconstructed and its descendants traced across the Pacific. Words for domesticated animals like pig and chicken follow similar patterns. These are not random similarities, but systematic correspondences showing shared origin and gradual diversification. This is how real linguistics works. It requires meticulous comparison, attention to phonetic detail, and respect for methodological rigor. Churchward ignored all of this. He was unaware of or chose to disregard the fundamental principles of historical linguistics. He did not account for regular sound changes. He did not distinguish between inherited vocabulary and borrowed words. He did not consider that languages in contact often exchange terms for new concepts, technology, or trade goods. Instead, he collected words that seemed similar and declared them evidence of Mu. His method also suffered from selection bias. He highlighted similarities while ignoring vast differences. Pacific languages have complex grammars, distinct phonological systems, and unique vocabularies. If they all descended from a single Mu language 10,000 years ago, we would expect to find systematic correspondences throughout their structure. We do not. What we find are the patterns expected from the actual history. Austronesian languages showing common descent from a relatively recent ancestor, with older substrate languages in Melanesia showing different relationships. The concept of a universal mother tongue had been popular in the 19th century. Some scholars believed Hebrew was the original human language, from which all others derived. Others proposed Sanskrit or ancient Chinese. As linguistics matured as a discipline, these ideas were abandoned. Evidence showed that language families were distinct, with no proof of a single ultimate origin within the time frame of modern humans. Today, linguists recognize multiple independent language families with no established connections. Churchward's approach also reflected assumptions about cultural diffusion common in his era. He assumed that similar cultural elements in different societies must indicate historical contact or common origin. This diffusionist thinking has largely been replaced by recognition that humans independently develop similar solutions to similar problems. Agriculture arose independently in multiple regions. Pyramid-like structures appear in cultures with no contact. These similarities reflect common human cognition and shared challenges, not ancient connections. The damage done by Le Plongeon and Churchward's linguistic claims persists. Online forums still cite their word lists as evidence. People untrained in linguistics find the apparent similarities convincing. The actual relationships between Pacific languages, while well documented, are less widely known. Correcting linguistic misinformation requires explaining complex methodology, which is harder than presenting a simple list of similar-sounding words. Real linguistic research has provided profound insights into Pacific history. By reconstructing Proto-Austronesian and tracing its evolution, linguists have mapped the spread of farming peoples across the Pacific. They have identified words for technologies like sailing and pottery making, showing what knowledge these migrants possessed. They have revealed contact between Austronesian speakers and earlier populations, visible in borrowed vocabulary. This actual linguistic history is fascinating and complex, revealing 3,000 years of human movement, interaction, and adaptation. The lesson from Le Plongeon and Churchward's linguistic follies is about the importance of expertise. Language comparison seems simple. Find similar words, declare them related. But genuine linguistic analysis requires training, methodology, and intellectual discipline. Superficial similarities mislead. Random chance produces false patterns. Only systematic comparison, checking for regular correspondences across entire vocabularies, can establish true relationships. The languages of the Pacific tell their story clearly. We just need to listen carefully and apply proper methods to understand what they say. They speak of Taiwan and outrigger canoes, of island hopping and gradual expansion. They say nothing about Mu. The DNA trail, genetics, and the peopling of the Pacific. In the past 3 decades, genetic research has revolutionized our understanding of human history. Where archaeologists dig for artifacts and linguists compare vocabularies, geneticists read the code written in our cells. DNA carries a record of ancestry, migration, and mixture stretching back thousands of generations. For the Pacific, genetic evidence has confirmed, refined, and expanded what archaeology and linguistics suggested. The story written in Pacific Islander DNA contradicts every claim about Mu while revealing the true epic of ocean exploration. The genetic evidence begins with mitochondrial DNA. This genetic material passes from mother to child with minimal change, creating lineages that can be traced back through time. Researchers studying Pacific populations identified specific mitochondrial haplogroups associated with Austronesian expansion. These genetic markers originated in Southeast Asia and spread across the Pacific, following the same route indicated by pottery and language. The dates derived from genetic mutation rates match the archaeological timeline remarkably well. Y chromosome analysis tells the paternal side of the story. Like mitochondrial DNA, the Y chromosome passes largely unchanged from father to son. Studies of Pacific Islander Y chromosomes reveal patterns of migration and settlement. Some lineages show clear origins in Southeast Asia. Others indicate earlier populations in near Oceania. The mixing of these lineages shows where Austronesian migrants encountered and intermarried with existing populations, particularly in Melanesia. Whole genome sequencing provides even more detailed information. By analyzing DNA from across the entire genome, researchers can detect more subtle patterns of ancestry and admixture. Studies published in recent years have traced the genetic contribution of different populations to modern Pacific Islanders. The results show that Polynesians carry ancestry from both Austronesian migrants originating near Taiwan and Papuan populations who had lived in near Oceania for tens of thousands of years. The timing of genetic mixing reveals the path of settlement. When Austronesian-speaking peoples reached the Bismarck Archipelago around 3,500 years ago, they encountered populations already living there. Genetic evidence shows admixture occurred during this period. The resulting mixed population then expanded into remote Oceania, carrying both Austronesian and Papuan genetic heritage. This matches archaeological evidence of the Lapita culture emerging from contact between incoming migrants and established communities. Detailed genetic studies have mapped the expansion with precision. Research shows that Fiji was settled by populations carrying this mixed ancestry. From Fiji, groups moved to Tonga and Samoa. In Western Polynesia, the population consolidated for roughly 1,000 years. Then came the final expansion eastward. Genetic diversity patterns show founder effects, where small groups of settlers carry only a subset of the genetic variation from their source population. Each island shows slightly reduced diversity compared to its parent population, exactly what we expect from sequential settlement by small groups. The settlement of Rapa Nui demonstrates these patterns clearly. Genetic analysis of modern Rapa Nui people shows they descend primarily from Polynesian ancestors, but there is a small amount of Native American ancestry appearing in some individuals. This indicates contact between Polynesians and South American populations, most likely occurring after Rapa Nui was settled from other Polynesian islands. The genetic evidence confirms what some researchers suggested. Limited contact across the Pacific was possible, but it came late and from the Polynesian side, not from a hypothetical mu. Ancient DNA has added another dimension to Pacific genetics. Researchers have extracted and sequenced DNA from skeletal remains found in archaeological sites. These ancient genomes provide direct evidence of what early Pacific populations looked like genetically. Studies of ancient DNA from Vanuatu show the progression from initial settlers with high Papuan ancestry to later populations with increasing Austronesian genetic contribution. This tracks population movements and interactions over time, visible generation by generation. Genetic studies also reveal what did not happen. There is no evidence of an ancient, distinct population predating and separate from the known waves of human settlement. If Mu had existed as an advanced civilization with a large population, its genetic signature should appear in modern Pacific populations. It does not. The ancestry components of Pacific Islanders trace back to known populations, Southeast Asian Austronesians and Papuan peoples who had been in the region since the initial settlement of Sahol. There is no mysterious third component that could represent a lost continent's inhabitants. The peopling of the Americas offers a useful comparison. Genetic studies show Native Americans descend from populations that crossed from Siberia during the last ice age. Multiple waves of migration occurred at different times. The genetic evidence is clear and consistent. Similarly, the peopling of the Pacific shows clear origins and paths. The difference is that Pacific settlement happened more recently and can be traced in greater detail. The absence of anomalous genetic signals is significant. We know what population mixture and ancient ancestry look like in DNA. The Pacific shows exactly what we expect from the documented historical settlement, with no room for an undocumented mother civilization. Genetic research has also helped Pacific Islander communities reclaim their history. For generations, Western scholars speculated about Polynesian origins, sometimes proposing that they came from South America or other unlikely sources. These theories often reflected racist assumptions about who could accomplish sophisticated ocean voyaging. Genetic evidence has definitively proven that Polynesians originated in Asia, exactly as their own oral traditions maintained. DNA has given scientific confirmation to indigenous knowledge. The tools of genetics continue to improve. Newer methods can detect increasingly ancient ancestry and more subtle population movements. Recent research has identified genetic adaptations that helped Pacific peoples thrive in island environments. Genes related to body size, metabolism, and other traits show signatures of selection, indicating biological adaptation to Pacific life over multiple generations. This is evolution in action, visible in the human genome. Some genetic findings reveal unexpected details. Studies have found genetic variants associated with deep diving ability in some Pacific populations. These appear to have been selected for in communities that traditionally relied on diving for food and resources. The genetic evidence shows not just where people came from, but how they adapted to their new homes, developing biological traits suited to island survival. The DNA trail offers no support for mu. Instead, it tells a coherent story of human expansion that matches every other line of evidence. People moved from Southeast Asia through near Oceania and into the remote Pacific. They mixed with earlier populations in Melanesia. They carried plants, animals, and cultural knowledge from island to island. They adapted to new environments, both culturally and biologically. They became the diverse Pacific Islander populations we know today. This is visible in their genes, readable by anyone with the tools and training to analyze DNA. The code is clear. There is no lost continent, no mother civilization, no ancient people separate from the known history. Just humans moving across the ocean, leaving their genetic signature on every island they reached. Why we believe the psychology of lost civilizations. The story of Mu is false. The evidence against it is overwhelming and comes from multiple independent fields of research. Yet, people continue to believe in it. The question is not whether Mu existed, but why the idea persists. Understanding the psychology behind lost civilization beliefs reveals something important about how humans think, what we desire, and how we construct meaning from the past. Lost civilization myths offer simple explanations for complex phenomena. When confronted with impressive ancient monuments, it is easier to attribute them to a vanished advanced culture than to understand the actual techniques and social organization that made them possible. The real explanations require learning about engineering, resource management, and the capabilities of pre-industrial societies. The Mu explanation requires only accepting a single extraordinary claim. Cognitive psychology shows that humans prefer simple narratives to complex ones, even when the complex version is more accurate. These myths also satisfy a desire for meaning in randomness. The idea that a great civilization could vanish completely is both terrifying and oddly comforting. It suggests that even collapse is significant, part of a grand historical pattern, rather than mere contingency. Finding order in chaos, even tragic order, appeals to our psychological need for narrative structure. We want history to have meaning, to teach lessons, to reveal patterns. Mu provides that structure, however false. The appeal of forbidden knowledge plays a major role. Believers in Mu often position themselves as possessors of secret wisdom that mainstream academia refuses to acknowledge. This creates a sense of special insight and belonging to an enlightened minority. Psychologists recognize this as a form of motivated reasoning. People believe what makes them feel good about themselves. Being one of the few who know the truth is psychologically rewarding, providing a sense of superiority and purpose. Confirmation bias reinforces these beliefs. Once someone accepts the Mu hypothesis, they notice evidence that seems to support it while dismissing or ignoring contradictory information. An underwater rock formation becomes proof of ancient construction. A similarity between distant cultures becomes evidence of contact. A gap in the archaeological record becomes a space where Mu can hide. The mind filters information to maintain existing beliefs, a tendency that affects everyone but is especially powerful with emotionally satisfying beliefs. Lost civilization myths also express anxiety about our own society. Mu serves as a mirror. If an advanced civilization could vanish completely, what does that say about our future? Climate change, environmental destruction, and social instability make the Mu story feel relevant. It becomes a cautionary tale about the fragility of civilization. This emotional resonance makes the myth feel meaningful, even to those who might not literally believe in its historical reality. There is also an element of romanticism. The idea of a lost golden age is ancient and persistent across cultures. From the Greek notion of a golden age to the biblical Garden of Eden, humans have long imagined a perfect past from which we have fallen. Mu fits this template. It represents an age of wisdom and harmony, destroyed by catastrophe, leaving us diminished descendants struggling in a fallen world. This narrative structure is deeply embedded in human culture and psychology. Hyperdiffusionism, the idea that cultural innovations spread from a single source, appeals to those who prefer unity to diversity. The actual history of humanity is one of multiple independent innovations and countless cultural traditions. This complexity can be overwhelming. The hyperdiffusionist model, where one mother culture gave rise to all others, is simpler and more elegant. Simplicity is aesthetically pleasing, but not necessarily true. Some belief in Mu stems from misunderstanding how science works. People see that scientific theories change over time and conclude that any current scientific consensus might be wrong. This is a fundamental misunderstanding. Scientific theories do change, but they change based on new evidence and better explanations, not randomly or easily. The evidence against Mu comes from geology, archaeology, linguistics, and genetics. For Mu to be real, every one of these fields would need to be fundamentally mistaken. The probability of that is essentially zero. Cultural factors also play a role. In some communities, in Hawaii, organizations like the Polynesian Voyaging Society have reconstructed traditional navigation techniques and built replica voyaging canoes. The Hokulea, launched in 1975, has sailed tens of thousands of miles using only traditional navigation methods. These voyages proved that Polynesian exploration was deliberate and sophisticated, not accidental drift. They also trained a new generation in ancestral skills and knowledge that were nearly lost. Nainoa Thompson, a native Hawaiian navigator, learned from Mau Piailug, a master navigator from Sarawal in Micronesia. This transfer of knowledge bridged a gap created by colonialism and modernization. Thompson has since trained dozens of others, ensuring that non-instrument navigation survives into the future. This is not merely historical reenactment. It is the preservation of an intellectual tradition that represents thousands of years of accumulated wisdom. Universities across the Pacific have established programs led by indigenous scholars. These programs approach archaeology and anthropology differently than traditional Western departments. They emphasize collaboration with communities, respect for sacred sites, and the integration of oral histories with material evidence. This methodology produces richer and more nuanced understandings of the past. In New Zealand, Maori archaeologists have transformed how research is conducted. They work closely with iwi, the Maori tribes, to ensure that excavations respect cultural protocols and that findings benefit communities. This has led to important discoveries while maintaining cultural sensitivity. It also means that interpretations of sites consider Maori perspectives, not just Western archaeological frameworks. Language revitalization efforts across the Pacific have included recovering historical and genealogical knowledge embedded in indigenous languages. As languages are documented and taught to new speakers, the worldviews and knowledge systems they encode become accessible again. Many traditional chants and stories contain detailed historical information, but understanding them fully requires fluency in the language and cultural context. The Kumulupo, a Hawaiian creation chant, has been studied by scholars both Hawaiian and non-Hawaiian. Recent work by Hawaiian experts has revealed layers of meaning that earlier translations missed. The chant is not simply mythology, but contains genealogical information, ecological knowledge, and historical memory. It speaks of the formation of the islands, the arrival of different species, and the origins of the Hawaiian people. Understanding it properly requires both linguistic skill and cultural knowledge. Museums are changing as well. Institutions that once displayed Pacific artifacts as curiosities now involve Pacific Islander communities in curation and interpretation. Exhibits explain objects in the context of living cultures rather than presenting them as relics of the past. This shift acknowledges that Pacific cultures are not frozen in time, but continue to evolve while maintaining connections to ancestral traditions. Repatriation of cultural objects and human remains has become an important issue. Many museums and universities hold items taken from Pacific communities, often without consent. Indigenous groups are demanding their return. This is not just about objects, but about recognizing the rights of descendants to control their ancestors' remains and sacred items. Each successful repatriation represents a small restoration of agency and dignity. Digital technology has become a tool for cultural preservation and education. Online databases document traditional knowledge, making it accessible to community members and researchers. Virtual reconstructions of archaeological sites allow people to experience their heritage. Social media platforms enable indigenous historians to share information directly with audiences worldwide, bypassing traditional academic gatekeepers. Pacific Islander creators are using modern media to tell their own stories. Filmmakers, authors, and artists are producing work that centers Pacific perspectives. These cultural products combat stereotypes and provide alternatives to the exotic fantasies that have long dominated Western depictions of the Pacific. They show Pacific peoples as they are, contemporary people with deep roots and living traditions. The reclamation of history also means confronting uncomfortable truths about colonialism. Pacific communities are documenting the impacts of colonial policies, from land theft to cultural suppression. This historical reckoning is painful but necessary. Understanding what was lost or damaged under colonialism is essential for healing and moving forward. Climate change has given new urgency to Pacific Islander voices. Low-lying island nations face existential threats from rising seas. Pacific Islander climate activists bring both scientific understanding and traditional ecological knowledge to the discussion. They emphasize that their ancestors navigated and adapted to changing conditions for millennia, and that this resilience continues today, even as they demand that industrial nations address the crisis threatening their homelands. Traditional ecological knowledge is gaining recognition in scientific circles. Pacific peoples developed sophisticated understandings of marine ecosystems, weather patterns, and sustainable resource management over thousands of years. This knowledge is valuable not just historically, but for contemporary conservation and climate adaptation efforts. Indigenous-led conservation projects across the Pacific demonstrate the effectiveness of combining traditional and modern approaches. Educational curricula in Pacific nations increasingly incorporate indigenous history and perspectives. Children learn about their ancestors' voyaging achievements, their sophisticated social systems, and their artistic traditions. This builds cultural pride and counters decades of colonial education that portrayed Pacific peoples as primitive or backward. It also ensures that future generations will have the knowledge to continue reclaiming and preserving their heritage. The reclamation is not complete. Challenges remain. Funding for indigenous-led research is often limited. Academic institutions can be slow to change. Some communities still struggle to access information about their own heritage held in distant archives and museums. But the trajectory is clear. Pacific history is being told more and more by Pacific peoples themselves. This shift has direct implications for myths like Mu. When Pacific Islanders control the narrative about their past, there is no space for Western fantasies of lost continents. Indigenous scholars point out that their actual history, their real achievements in navigation, engineering, and social organization are extraordinary enough. They do not need invented civilizations to make their past impressive. The reclamation of Pacific history means the displacement of myths like Mu by the truth, which is more compelling than any fiction. The true legacy of Mu, a mirror for our own civilization. Mu never existed. This is certain. No geological evidence supports it. No archaeological finds confirm it. No linguistic analysis validates it. No genetic data suggests it. Every scientific discipline that touches on the question reaches the same conclusion. The myth of Mu is just that, a myth created in the late 19th century and elaborated in the early 20th, yet it persists. Its persistence is itself meaningful, revealing truths about us rather than about the past. The myth of Mu functions as a mirror. When we look at stories of lost civilizations, we see our own fears reflected back. The central narrative is always the same. A great culture achieves remarkable heights, then falls to catastrophe. This resonates because we recognize the fragility of our own civilization. We live in an age of environmental crisis where human activity threatens the planetary systems that sustain us. The story of Mu's destruction by natural cataclysm feels uncomfortably relevant. Climate change gives the Mu myth new emotional power. Rising seas threaten coastal cities and island nations. Extreme weather events become more frequent. Ecosystems collapse under pressure. The parallels to Mu's supposed fate are obvious. A civilization brought down by forces it could not control, or perhaps by forces it unleashed itself. The myth becomes a warning, even if the historical details are false. But this is where the myth becomes dangerous. It suggests that civilizational collapse is inevitable, external, beyond human control. This is fatalistic and disempowering. Real history shows something different. Civilizations do not usually collapse suddenly due to natural disasters. They decline through combinations of environmental stress, social choices, and political failure. Understanding this is important because it means we have agency. Our choices matter. We are not doomed to repeat a pattern that never actually happened. The Mu myth also reveals our anxieties about knowledge. The idea that an advanced civilization possessed wisdom, now lost, speaks to a sense that we have forgotten something important. In an age of rapid technological change and environmental destruction, many feel disconnected from sustainable ways of living. The fantasy of Mu represents a desire to recover that imagined balance. But again, this is based on false premises. Our ancestors did not possess secret knowledge that modernity has lost. They had different knowledge, suited to different contexts. We cannot look to imaginary past civilizations for solutions to contemporary problems. What we can do is learn from actual history. The real Pacific peoples showed remarkable adaptability. They crossed the largest ocean on Earth with Stone Age technology. They found and settled islands separated by thousands of miles of open water. They developed sustainable island economies. They created complex societies. They adapted to changing conditions repeatedly over centuries. This genuine human achievement offers real lessons in resilience, innovation, and sustainability. The environmental history of the Pacific includes both successes and failures. Easter Island's Ecological shows what happens when resources are overexploited on a limited landmass. Other islands maintain stable populations and ecosystems for centuries. The difference lay in social choices and resource management strategies. These are lessons we can actually learn from, unlike the imaginary example of Mu. The persistence of the Mu myth also speaks to a hunger for wonder. People want to believe that the past holds mysteries, that there are still secrets to be discovered. This desire is not wrong. It reflects curiosity and imagination, valuable human traits. The problem is when wonder leads to rejecting reality in favor of fantasy. Real history and real science provide plenty of genuine wonder. We do not need to invent it. The deepest truth revealed by the Mu myth might be about meaning-making. Humans create stories to make sense of existence. We always have. Myths serve social and psychological functions. They explain, they warn, they inspire. Mu functioned as a myth even for Churchward, even before it entered popular culture. He created it to explain what he saw as connections between cultures. The explanation was wrong, but the impulse to find patterns and connections is fundamental to human cognition. Modern society struggles with meaning in a secular age. Traditional religious narratives have less hold on many people. Science provides explanations, but not always comfort or purpose. Myths like Mu fill a gap, offering narratives that feel meaningful even if they are not true. This is why debunking them is never entirely successful. Facts alone do not address the emotional and psychological needs that myths fulfill. Perhaps the real legacy of Mu is the reminder that we must be careful about what we choose to believe. Critical thinking is not just an intellectual exercise, it is a survival skill. In an age of misinformation, conspiracy theories, and alternative facts, the ability to distinguish truth from fiction matters enormously. The Mu myth is relatively harmless compared to some contemporary false beliefs. But the cognitive habits that allow someone to believe in Mu, despite the evidence, are the same habits that allow belief in more dangerous fictions. Education is the answer, but not just education in facts. We need education in how to think, how to evaluate claims, how to distinguish good evidence from bad. We need to teach why the scientific method works, what makes a claim credible, and how expertise develops. These metacognitive skills apply far beyond the question of lost continents. We also need to make truth compelling. The real story of Pacific settlement is extraordinary. Humans with no metal tools, no writing, no compasses, spread across an ocean covering a third of the Earth's surface. They developed navigation techniques of stunning sophistication. They transported entire agricultural packages thousands of miles. They created diverse cultures adapted to environments ranging from high volcanic islands to tiny coral atolls. They built monuments that still stand. They preserved knowledge across generations through oral tradition. They survived and thrived. This happened. This is real. And it is more impressive than any fantasy of Mu. The challenge for science communicators, educators, and indigenous knowledge keepers is to tell these true stories in ways that satisfy our hunger for meaning and wonder. We must compete not just with myths, but with the emotional appeal those myths hold. Facts and evidence are necessary, but not sufficient. We need narratives that show why truth matters, why reality is fascinating, why our actual history is worth knowing and celebrating. The Mu myth ultimately fails because it denies agency to the people whose actual achievements it obscures. It replaces the real accomplishments of Pacific peoples with a fantasy of borrowed wisdom from a vanished continent. This is not just historically wrong, it is ethically wrong. It perpetuates colonial attitudes that denied non-Western peoples the credit for their own innovations. Rejecting Mu is not just about accepting science. It is about respecting the actual people whose history matters far more than any myth. In the end, Mu tells us about ourselves, our fears, our desires, our cognitive biases, our hunger for meaning. These are all very human traits. Understanding them helps us understand why we believe what we believe. And perhaps that understanding can help us choose truth over fiction, complex reality over simple fantasy, and the genuine achievements of our ancestors over the imaginary accomplishments of civilizations that never were. That would be the true legacy of Mu, not as a lost continent, but as a lesson in how we think and why that matters.